Chapter 5:20. This business trip was mainly about going to hell. In the literal sense, he was going to hell. As one of the leading teachers, he took the students who were about to graduate to hell to support the Research Institute's construction of the third phase of the Abyss. The main person in charge was Weischer's old acquaintance, Andrea, while Weischer and Martin were the assistants. There were a total of 91 members. 40 of them were scholars and workers drawn from the school's direct departments, and the rest were all students. With Weischer's power, no one would say anything if he added 2 more people. Or rather, it was good enough that someone was willing to do the hard work of going to hell. According to the task assigned to him by the teaching and research room, it was mainly to collect some special plant samples for research. As for the rest, it was up to him. It sounded like a vacation, but Weischer didn't think that his cheap teacher would be so kind. There was probably a trap waiting for him. Logically speaking, he shouldn't have brought Yuan and Hut in the woods. But weren't there so many people who weren't as good as them, with Professor Andrea personally leading the team, and so many people from the second and first phase of the project, as well as the local person in charge? At least the safety factor was guaranteed. Moreover, although the ivory tower liked to mess around, they wouldn't joke about the students. After all, it was an educational institution. If something bad really happened, they wouldn't let the students get involved at all. The teachers would be the first to send them off. In this case, why not bring these 2 students and let them broaden their horizons? Moreover, wasn't he here as a teacher? Well, in a sense, being around him might be a little more dangerous than being in hell. The Yuan family and the Lin family would have the necessary protective measures. The Yuan family's grandfather doted on his eldest granddaughter and couldn't wait to dress her up before she went out. The Lin family had always been paranoid. Wherever they went, they wanted to be the first to know the escape route. If there was danger, they would definitely be the first to run. No one would have this kind of reaction. As for the curriculum, for classical music appreciation, Weischer left homework and lesson plans, and a student who was about to graduate from the concert group would take over the class. There shouldn't be any problems. And the ecology of the Abyss had nothing to do with him. There were plenty of teaching assistants. Moreover, the book had already been published, and there was nothing else he could teach her. The vice principal approved a leave of absence without any expression on his face. He only told them to live up to the expectations of the school, and then waved his hand to let them go. Everything went unbelievably smoothly. At 7:00 the next morning, Weischer changed into the gray windbreaker and saddle bag that he had not worn for a long time. He felt a burst of joy from the bottom of his heart. After saying goodbye to his family, he went to the auditorium where they had gathered before the departure. There were already many people outside the auditorium. Martin, who was the youngest among them, was standing at the front. When he saw Zhang Zian coming over, he retracted his gaze and pretended not to see him. Perhaps he regretted not being able to touch Weischer's trophy. Why was this child being so polite? Weischer sighed and gave up the idea of greeting him. He turned to the side, not far away. There were large and small metal boxes piled up into a small hill. They were all instruments and tools to be brought over. Raymond, who had met Weischer once before, was currently leading a few people to sort out the items and take inventory. He wrapped his coat around his waist early in the morning and only wore a large T-shirt that was stretched by his muscles. After seeing Weischer, he waved his hand enthusiastically. "I didn't expect Mr. Weischer to have a business trip as soon as you arrived. You're so early. Have you eaten?" "I've eaten. No need." Weischer declined the bread that Raymond handed over. He looked at the iconic truck behind him and asked, "Mr. Raymond, are you coming too?" After all, he's from the school guard. He's the head of the bodyguards there, and he has to do rough work. Raymond waved his hand casually and invited Huaishur and the others to sit with him on the pile of boxes. After exchanging a few pleasantries, most of the people had already arrived. In addition to Lin Shurjiu and Yuan Yuan, who looked very obedient next to Huaishur, the other students stood in groups on the small square. Some of them obviously didn't sleep last night and were staring at the 2 dark circles under their eyes. Everyone was talking excitedly about something. They were full of expectations for this trip to the abyss. Looking at it this way, he felt more and more like a teacher leading a team on an excursion. It was just that the following journey was unlikely to be easy and pleasant. "Is everyone here?" After Andrea arrived and counted the number of people, she nodded and didn't make a long speech. She simply divided the students into groups according to the division of labor and duties. Then she waved her hand and signaled the students to get ready to go. Amidst the low tremors, the dust on the ground suddenly rose into the air. When all the students looked at each other, the entire small square began to sink rapidly. Accompanied by the blazing sparks of friction between countless gears, the place where they were located sank into the ground. The small square began to slide diagonally along the steel rails like a large freight elevator. The entire underground of the ivory tower had been hollowed out long ago. The huge, ancient-looking metropolis was, in fact, supported by countless super-large structures. Just like the Rubik's Cube, as long as it rotated slightly, it would reveal a completely different appearance. At this moment, as the scene in front of them quickly turned, the faint morning light in the gap above their heads quickly faded away. Then, it was replaced by countless complex structures that closed together. With the complex takeoff, landing, and operation, in the sharp sound of steel colliding, the warm and peaceful scenery disappeared without a trace and was replaced by a neat order composed of steel and machinery. The students couldn't help but become serious and were infected by this solemn atmosphere. About 10 seconds later, the landing of the platform quickly stopped and pieced together on the solid ground. As if it had always been like this, only the different lines on the floor reminded them that they had come to a different place. White light shone down from the high ceiling on the wide platform, except for a few workers walking around. No one else could be seen, and an old-fashioned steam train also slowly stopped next to the platform with a low roar. The train was not long, with a total of 7 or 8 carriages. The interior decoration was quite exquisite, and there were berths and toilets. It was thoughtful but not luxurious, and would not give people the illusion of a vacation. On the other side of the crane, Raymond's truck was loaded with all the goods into the cargo compartment, and Raymond took the hat and key from the conductor's hand and went directly to the driver's seat. "Well, everyone get on the train according to your groups and numbers. Be careful not to forget your luggage. After we start the train, we won't give you time to get it. Starting from the first group, Teacher Huaishur will supervise." Okay. Huaishur reached out, took the list, and then handed it to Lin Shurjiu and Yuan Yuan. If the master had something to do, the disciple would do it. He just sat on the train and pretended to do it. Lin Shurjiu and Yuan Yuan would take care of the rest. In fact, the main command and coordination was Lin Shurjiu, and Yuan Yuan was responsible for supervision. The girl in the gray skirt was still carrying a leather suitcase with the Shanjun sword in it. She just stood there, even if she did not speak. But her usual dignified and serious expression made the atmosphere serious. She was also responsible for supervising Lin Shurjiu, so that he did not deliberately put people who were enemies and did not see eye to eye with each other, so that sparks could be created. All the students who got on the train would respectfully nod and greet Huaishur when they passed by him, and then go in obediently. Many of them did not know who Martin was in front of Huaishur. Instead, They were confused. What's the matter with the arrogant kid next to him? Why is he staring at me? Martin was very angry. Martin did not speak. Martin decided not to argue with this group of low IQ, simple-minded people. Martin entered single-player mode. This made Huaisher very surprised. His prestige among the students was not low, although the botany mode he represented was only a compulsory course for first-year students. The senior students did not see him much, but they still heard of this teacher, who had skyrocketed in his first month at the school. And since he held a fan meeting at the Sea Fishing Club, there were even fewer people who had not heard of him. Morgan and the others wanted to suppress the news and pretend that it did not happen. But the problem was that one of the people who went that day was Lynn Shergio. As soon as Huaisher stepped out of the door, the 4K Blu-ray version of the fan meeting was posted on the school forum. The direct result was that the turnover of the Ivory Tower cafeteria that night dropped by half. New idols, beautiful teachers, vicious students from rich and powerful families, secret clubs, unspeakable conspiracies, and unimaginable darkness. Everyone did some shameful things behind closed doors. More than half an hour. The scale was amazing. The process was full of twists and turns. The plot was full of ups and downs, tense and exciting. Everyone was young and vigorous, who had never seen such a thing before. The combination of all kinds of elements that made people blush and their hearts beat made many people unable to sleep well at night, after a sleepless night with teacher Jacob groaning. They were full of admiration for Huaisher, who was both virtuous and artistic. It was impossible not to admire him. Do you know the 108 ways to cut off a head? Have you seen it? Have you learned it? In just a few days, Huaisher's notoriety had spread from the Pureblood Club to the new students, and the Ivory Tower branch of the Prince of Paradise fan club received more than 4,000 applications to join. The price of the out-of-print Prince of Paradise card soared by 10% again, and the sales of the Star Cluster card pack, Judge, soared again. The business executives of Super World Records laughed so hard that they could not close their legs and wanted to give Huaisher another medal for the Little Expert of the Year. Soon, the students boarded the train in an orderly manner. After the announcement, the train set off amidst the rhythmic beating of the rails. It was estimated that it would take 71 hours, passing through 4 border stations. There were 97 passengers in total. Destination: Hell. Depth: 9. Final station: the Land of Dusk. Chapter 521. In the office of the Ivory Tower. In front of the huge TV screen, the game screen paused. Are we leaving? Russell heard the sound of the train whistle fading away. He looked back with a confused expression. Did I forget something? After waiting for a long time, he remembered that his new secretary was also on the train. Now, no one reminded him. He shook his head helplessly and looked away. Forget it. It doesn't matter anyway. He picked up the controller again and sighed from the bottom of his heart. It's all good things, all good things. Outside the window behind him, a gust of wind blew in and flipped open the documents on the table. A red warning letter mixed in with the documents quietly fell into the trash can. Obviously, this time, Huaisher and the others didn't get to use the inner ring of the Bifrost. They could only rely on the conventional method of moving between the borders with vehicles, lowering the depth step by step, and finally preparing to enter Hell. Therefore, compared to other more convenient and faster methods, the time taken was inevitably longer. However, the advantage of the conventional method was that safety was naturally guaranteed. There were often fixed routes between the borders. Many organizations would regularly clean up the surrounding threats to ensure that the routes were smooth. If they were in the Asian region, they could use the undercurrent to travel faster. But after leaving the Asian region, they couldn't see the endless ocean. Instead, it was replaced by an endless rain of iron falling from the sky. Huaisher sat by the window and could see the vast wilderness, the surging Mercury River, and the dry and cracked land outside. It seemed like they were in the Gobi Desert. The sky was shrouded in thick clouds. As lightning flashed across, a silver metallic light constantly appeared. And in the clouds that resembled liquid metal, sometimes without warning, there would be waves of condensed iron rain falling from the sky. The metal material that gathered in the clouds into the size of a fist was wrapped in a roaring toward the earth like a meteor shower. After leaving a burn mark, it quickly dried up and collapsed into dust, disappearing without a trace. Occasionally, someone could be seen riding a huge motorcycle, wearing heavy protective clothing, chasing closely behind the clouds. He waited for the iron rain to descend before the metal completely disintegrated. He skillfully used tools to extract the small cores from the metal and put them into a jar. However, the number of shining cores was usually very small, and most of the time, nothing was found. Occasionally, when the iron rain hit the armor of their protective suits, dazzling sparks and loud noises would burst out. In the distance, under the gloomy sky, there was a huge and ferocious silhouette that looked like a spider slowly walking across the horizon. It was like a moving mountain range, chasing after the path of the iron rain and collecting resources. Seeing this scene, Huaisher knew that they had entered the territory of the Russian Federation. These were all phenomena caused when a large amount of matter in hell rose with the tide of the abyss and condensed at the border. Many large alchemy workshops would purchase these cores that had yet to dissipate and extract many common materials from them. It was equivalent to scavenging. In the Russian Federation, there were many border and outposts that relied on similar industries to earn profits. After all, it fell from the sky, and it would be a waste not to pick it up. That model, it's Petrograd. It's still in service. Andrea raised her eyes and looked at the mountain-like, spider-shaped creation in the distance. She suddenly felt a little emotional. When I just graduated from university, I interned on it. At that time, Anton was already the second mate of Petrograd. I met him there. You're from the Russian Federation? Huaisher was curious. Andrea stroked her slightly wine-red hair and raised her eyebrows happily. I can only tell you part of it, right? My grandmother and ex-husband were, but I moved to America in my father's generation. In high school, many little bitches saw that I was thin and small and wanted to play with me. I could only use the excellent tradition of the Russian Federation to communicate with them. To be honest, it's so interesting now that I think about it. Sorry for the disrespect. Huaisher cupped his hands. He didn't expect the big sister in front of him to have the blood of a bear. No wonder she didn't blush when she drank 2 pounds of wine at dinner a few days ago. She even wrote a sonnet on the spot. He didn't expect her to have so much martial virtue in her bones. Come on. Andrea glanced at him, found a more comfortable sofa in the teacher's box, lay down, and took out her mobile phone to play games. Her voice was not small. In the corner, Martin looked up and saw Andrea. He didn't say anything and silently took out earplugs from his pocket. He ignored it very much. Huaisher originally thought that she would take out a big book, like Martin. He didn't expect her to be so fashionable and keep up with the times. Where are we going next? He asked casually. The next stop is the Trinity Monastery. After refueling there, we will borrow the road from Huching Fire City in the Middle East and make the final supply at the Abyss Outpost in America. Finally, we will go directly into deep stealth and go to hell. It will be very fast, but the previous journey is more troublesome. There is no way. The place is remote. After Huaisher nodded, he slept for a while. When he woke up, it was time for dinner. Everyone took turns to the dining car for dinner. The materials in the dining car were quite rich. The chef's cooking was okay, and there was even a hot pot to order. Looking at the group of students eating hot pot and singing songs, Weisher felt a little numb in his scalp. Won't something happen if you do this? It's okay. We're not children anymore. Will we be scalded by hot pot? Andrea waved her hand without minding. No, isn't the atmosphere a little too cheerful? Weisher sighed. Even if everyone was very serious when they just got on the bus, after all, they were just a group of students, and their nature was exposed. Relaxed is relaxed, happy is happy, as long as they don't slack off. It's all right. Anyway, what greeted them when they arrived at the place was cruel education. Before that, it's not bad to eat hot pot and sing songs and go to hell happily. Then Andrea dispelled the conjecture in his heart. The female professor said, I started it. All right. Weisher shook his head, lamented the depravity of the ivory tower, and then raised his hand to ask for a pot of tripe. He saw it on the menu. The train itself also has the task of transporting materials and water for the Hell Branch. There are a lot of things. The disadvantage is that if you want to eat something special, you have to make it yourself. But no one dares to let the hell cooking demon cook for them. Weisher can only give up bitterly. He is alone with his tripe, his hands and feet are cold, and his breath is cold. In the last few hours of rest after dinner, the students seized the time to play games or send messages on the Wi-Fi. After passing Witching Fire City, these electronic products will be collected. First, there is no signal at all after arriving in hell. Second, unless it is a professional model and has been processed by alchemy, it is still unknown whether these things are useful after leaving the scene. Sometimes there is even a hidden danger of explosion, so they are simply collected. Taking advantage of this time, Weisher took Yuan and Lin Shurjo to distribute everyone's identity cards, and then each group was assigned a special model of short-medium-range walkie-talkie. It is worth mentioning that little Shurjo seems to have become a good friend of many people. Whether men or women, everyone likes this seemingly harmless and enthusiastic young man very much, and they are also curious about what is in the birdcage covered with a layer of black cloth in his hand. Yuan, who is really safe and harmless, is even more awe-inspiring. Because of her dignified and serious temperament, few people dare to come over and talk to her. She doesn't seem to be interested in chatting. After finishing her work, she returned to her position, put on her headphones, and calmly cared for her weapon. With her movements, the Mountain Lord giant sword made a low sound from time to time, and the chill spread. Weisher stood beside her and watched for a while. Without saying anything, he turned and left. Since they are all prepared, there is no need to waste his saliva. It's better to go back to sleep. Teachers are treated well in this way. They have a sleeper and don't have to lie in a chair. In the faint noise of talking outside, Weisher gradually fell asleep. The train galloped all the way, and after crossing a long distance, it gradually approached hell. When the endless wilderness disappeared at the end of the line of sight, it was replaced by the eternal burning fire under the steel track. When Witching Fire City was about to arrive, Weisher opened his eyes. He saw the figure standing at the head of his bed. You're really alert. Andrea chuckled softly. I thought you would suddenly pull out your sword and stab me. That's overvigilance. Weisher shook his head and got up from the bed. What's the matter? I'll sleep for a while in the second half of the night. Andrea said, Martin is still a child. I'm not at ease, so I'll leave the vigil task to you. After a pause, her expression became serious. In order to protect the safety of the train, you can do it at will. Don't worry about it. Are you so sure about me? If you had just pulled out your sword, I wouldn't have been so relieved. Andrea said, Is there any other problem? Weisher asked straightforwardly, Do you think there will be an attack on the road? Maybe. After thinking about it, Andrea decided to tell Weisher the bottom line first. We said this time it's support, but in fact, it should be an emergency. There's something wrong with the Twilight Village. Huaisha frowned. Her words were too vague. The specific level of confidentiality there is relatively high. The only ones who know the inside story are probably the headmaster and a few others. Andrea thought for a moment and told him, as far as I know, after the report for help was sent, when the teaching and research office was considering the manpower in addition to me, they thought of you first. The possibility of doing it will not be too low. Huaisha couldn't help but shake his head. On the bright side, maybe someone wants to hear the cello play. It's also possible that they want to have a good meal. Andrea laughed. The teaching and research office should have said so earlier so that we could have brought a dining car. Jokes aside, Andrea sincerely admired Huaisha's carelessness. He was indeed the double flower red stick of the Asian Astronomical Association, the future chief hatchet man. Who knows, maybe she would kill him while she was cooking with the cello. Huaisha was obviously one level lower than her, but now when he took over this job, Andrea's heart suddenly felt relaxed. She inexplicably felt relieved. At the beginning of the month, Baizé said that my monthly votes were very poor and punished me to kneel on the keyboard for an afternoon. Good brother, good sister, can you help me? Chapter 522. By the way, if you really want to do it, why do you still need to bring students? Social practice. Andrea said, there is still a lot of maintenance work to be done locally. When the time comes, let them help out and move around the periphery to gain experience. The teaching and research room has assessed the danger level as an extracurricular internship. As long as you pay attention to your safety and follow the instructions of the teacher, there won't be any accidents. Internship? Huaisha was amused. The internship in the ivory tower was a bit too hardcore. Andrea shrugged and said calmly, in the ivory tower, this is called an internship. A little lower is called an excursion. A few teaching assistants are enough. The teachers don't need to participate. Don't worry, don't be too stressed. The ivory tower has not declined to the extent that it needs a new teacher to turn the tide. This is at best an inspection. It's convenient for you to accumulate more experience. Maybe. Huaisha sighed. Anyway, he did not have any expectations for Russell's integrity. As a veteran of vehicle explosions, even if someone told him that there was a destructive element in the car, he would not react, let alone be attacked. His only expectation for this car was that it could send him to his destination in one piece, or even not in one piece. Before leaving the box, Huaisha could not help but be curious and asked one last time, speaking of which, what was the level of the astral in the teaching and research room last time? The part one participated in. Yes. Huaisha nodded. Doctoral graduation thesis defense. No big deal. Andrea calmly put on an eye mask for herself. She did not say whether she was the one who defended the thesis or the one who reviewed the thesis defense. Lying on the bed, she fell into a deep sleep. She was relieved to leave the safety of the entire car to Huaisha. This gave Huaisha a headache. In the following time, Huaisha first went to the front of the car to say hello to Raymond, then turned back and walked around the car to patrol. Most of the students had fallen asleep in their seats. Some of them were still awake, reading books or playing cards in silence. Lin Shurjo didn't mingle with his new friends. Instead, he was lying in the corner next to Yuan Yuan. He was sleeping soundly in his sleeping bag, with snot bubbles coming out of his nose. As a veteran sufferer of persecutory delusions, he knew the safest place in the car. Hearing someone walk in, the girl who was resting with her eyes closed looked up. Huaisha waved his hand, indicating for them to continue resting. After making sure that they were keeping the cage of dreams by their side, he left. The latter half of the night was very quiet. Nothing happened when passing by Huicheng Fire City. He also got out of the car and went to the platform to get some air. There was a lingering smell of sulfur in the slightly hot air. This place was very much in line with the description of hell in traditional stories. At the border of the Middle East, the periodic eruptions of abyssal precipitates spread across the land in the form of flames. The city was built on lava and mountain peaks in the form of steel frames, sultry all year round. As one of the few large borders closest to hell, it had a rather gloomy atmosphere. In the station, the platform was empty. Only a well-dressed middle-aged man came up to talk. "Is it convenient for you to borrow a light, friend?" Huaisher rubbed a lighter from his pocket and handed it over. The middle-aged man was quite grateful and returned it after using it. After the two men chatted casually for a while, Huaisher saw that Raymond had finished negotiating with the station, so he politely said goodbye and went back to the car. The middle-aged man with some gray hair stood in place, smoking silently, just with his back to Huaisher's face. His eyebrows were slightly raised. After feeling that the beacon he left on the lighter disappeared, he chuckled softly. He didn't expect that the people in the ivory tower were so cautious. Or were they on guard against him from the beginning? Obviously, they looked very easy to talk to. After he walked down the steps of the platform, a young man came forward. "Mr. Quinn, I saw it clearly when I unloaded the goods. It was indeed the car of the ivory tower." Quinn nodded, thought for a moment, and said, "Tell the doctor and the colonel for me that I want to go to the scene to test it." The young man was stunned and looked strange. "What's the matter?" Quinn asked. "Well, the doctor also asked me to tell you." The young man paused and said seriously, "It's okay to try." Quinn was stunned for a moment and then laughed. Since leaving Witching Fire City, Huaisher's mood has been a little uneasy. After returning to the carriage, he sat in the middle of the carriage and meditated, tapping the spine of the sword of virtue with his hand. Something always brought him a sense of uneasiness. He began to recall. When he recalled the middle-aged man he met on the platform, he couldn't help frowning. Now that he thought about it, although he didn't feel malice or killing intent, the man gave Huaisher a very strange feeling. He looked serious, but inexplicably felt that it was a disguise. Something even more unique was stirring under his smile, almost overflowing. Before entering hell, Huaisher didn't think it would be an accident to meet such a person. But most of the ascendants were a little weird, so he wasn't sure. After thinking about it, he got up and went to wake Andrea up. If it was Huaisher's illusion, then she just slept a few hours less. If he guessed right, then she would have more protection when she was in danger. After listening to Huaisher's analysis, although Andrea felt that it didn't seem necessary, she woke up and didn't sleep. After washing her face, she stayed with Huaisher from 4 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock in the morning. Still nothing happened. Andrea was not angry or dissatisfied, but Huaisher was getting more and more embarrassed. Just as he was about to persuade Andrea to continue sleeping, the female professor stopped flipping through the book and raised her head. "You're right." She shook her head and sighed softly. "Something is coming." As soon as her voice fell, a dense sound of breaking came from the roof of the carriage. It was like water droplets hitting the iron roof of the carriage. "Is it raining?" Huaisher and Andrea frowned at the same time. They hadn't left the Middle East to go into hell. In the eternal sea of fire in the Middle East, not to mention rain, even sewage was a resource that could be used as currency. How could they be so extravagant as to turn it into rain and fall from the sky? Soon, the breaking and breaking sound became clearer and clearer, as if there were countless limbs hitting the roof of the carriage, forming a flood that quickly spread over the carriage. Then, with thin threads hanging from the roof, it suddenly smashed on the window, casting a palm-sized shadow in the fire outside the window. It was a spider. A confused student screamed, and his face quickly turned pale. Those palm-sized spiders crawled nimbly on the car windows, dragging their huge abdominal sacs. The colorful spiders did not appeal to people's liking, only ugliness and disgust. Now, with the rapid increase in the number of spiders, this fear began to grow rapidly. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The entire train was quickly covered by colorful spiders, trying to invade every opening. Countless scarlet compound, eyes opened, staring at the vigilant faces through the window. Suddenly, they spat out venom. Chee! That wasn't the sound of the window being corroded by venom, but the sizzling sound of dead pork being thrown into a blazing furnace. The flames were tangible, but when the temperature soared to hundreds of degrees in an instant, heating up into a febrile wind that could burn all flesh and blood, it was still invisible and formless. Andrea quickly wrote a line of formula in the air, and the fire at her fingertips flickered and extinguished. After the invisible law broke free from her control, it began to expand and spread out in all directions, substituting volume and space, specifying the vector and scale, and then entering the source. Finally, the result was obtained, combining thermodynamics and aerodynamics, using the red dragon's blood to extract the heat of countless magma under the tracks. A terrifying burning current instantly enveloped the entire train. But through the window, the temperature inside the carriage didn't change at all. Even the air conditioner was still working normally, giving people the illusion that everything outside the window was like an illusion. The distorted air shrouded the train, and in the blink of an eye, the high-temperature burning current turned countless squirming spiders into ashes. The train quickly collapsed. Before they were burned to ashes, they were broken into pieces of paper, which quickly turned yellow and finally turned into pitch-black ashes. At this moment, there seemed to be an invisible flame covering the entire train. It formed an invisible barrier. Everything that dared to enter within 3 meters of the train would be brutally burned into black ashes in an instant. Even steel and rocks were the same. "Is it Andrea?" On the roof of the train, a squatting figure whispered softly the heresy of the thermodynamics classroom. "The great red dragon? Hey, is the ivory tower in such a hurry?" Ryan was wearing an unusually conspicuous raincoat with countless small mirrors attached to it, making him look shiny. But under the raincoat, the unusually high temperature couldn't penetrate it. He didn't lose a single strand of hair. The sandbar veil, a relic found in an eternally hot hell. It couldn't resist any rain, but it was good against the high temperature. At this moment, colorful pieces of paper were constantly being folded in his hand. The pieces of paper fell from his fingertips like rainwater and landed in his arms. They quickly wriggled and formed thumb-sized spiders that quickly crawled under the raincoat. Under the illumination of the fire, his figure suddenly became illusory and disappeared. At the same time, the alarm in the train sounded. "Intruder has entered the train." Raymond's voice came from the walkie-talkie. "The warehouse has been sealed. Don't worry, I'll leave the rest to you." At the same time, a dense rustling sound had been heard from the air conditioner pipes. Like a torrent, it spread through all the gaps in the cabin. Under the invisible raincoat, Ryan smiled happily and waved his hand in the dark. Thousands of spiders made sharp hissing sounds, and sharp thorns drilled out of the air conditioner. They dragged their fat abdominal sacs and couldn't wait to pounce on the food below. It was time for Tao-Tai. Then they saw pairs of eyes that were as red as their own. They had been waiting for a long time. Caw! In the brief silence, on the luggage rack in the train, countless fog-like crows flapped their wings excitedly, unable to hide their excitement. Yes, the time for Tao-Tai had come. End of the 2 chapters. Please vote QAQ. Chapter 5:23. As soon as the siren sounded, Huai Shi, who was next to Andrea, raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Amidst the panicked and chaotic students, a clear voice rang out. The hut in the woods, who was still sleeping soundly, was awakened. He propped himself up like a bug and looked at the birdcage in shock. The cage was opened. By who? Then something that made his scalp tingle happened in front of his eyes. In the birdcage, the cold, sore substance that was bound by countless dreams trembled slightly. It was as if death, after condensing into a substance, began to boil again. After losing control, the nuclear power plant went crazy. After all the coolant was burned dry, the crazy core began to melt, radiating thousands of times more ferocious and cruel. In a daze, Lynn Sturgio had a strange illusion. It was as if a seemingly eternal dream was shattered, and then something in the dream began to wake up behind the black cloth. 1 pair, 2 pairs, 3 pairs. Countless scarlet eyes emerged from the darkness like a bloody nebula. The black cloth began to change shape and rapidly expanded. "Get down!" Without hesitation, Lin Sturgio shouted at Yuan Yuan, and then his whole body fell to the ground. In the next moment, the black cloth was torn apart by countless sharp beaks. As thousands of pairs of gray mist wings spread out, high-pitched and sharp chirps echoed throughout the train. When the cage of dreams suddenly opened, flickering lights rose to the ceiling of the carriage. And under the illumination of those flickering lights, the swaying tide gushed out from the cage, and a hurricane rose. Yuan Yuan subconsciously raised his hand to block in front of his eyes. Then, he felt a mighty tide sweep past him. One after another, cold and fleeting silhouettes quickly appeared, rising from the spreading fog tide. They flapped their wings, lowered their scarlet eyes, and cast an indifferent gaze on the mortal world. In the blink of an eye, the crow tide spread, swept past everyone, and covered every carriage, arrogantly looking down on all the panicked students. Being looked at by such cold and cruel eyes, the originally restless and chaotic atmosphere quickly froze. When Lin Sturgio on the ground finally turned over with difficulty and climbed out of the sleeping bag, he saw those scarlet eyes looking at him, with a hint of judgment and consideration. The hut in the forest was stunned. Soon, the flock of crows coldly moved their gazes away and looked at the source of the rustling sound behind the cabin. A trace of anticipation gradually appeared in his scarlet eyes. They silently spread their wings, moved their sharp claws, and raised their sharp beaks. Under the light, a cold gleam of steel appeared. He waited quietly, waiting for the food to arrive, waiting for them to obediently climb into his plate. When countless venomous spiders crawled out from the cracks, they saw those eyes filled with mockery and malevolence. In the short period of silence, other than the sharp chirps, there were no disturbances or disputes. All the crow restrained their impulses, shook their wings, stepped on their sharp claws, and looked at the food in front of them, waiting patiently. At the end of the carriage, the young man with his back facing the fog waved his hand indifferently. In that instant, the feast of Tautai began. Accompanied by thousands of high-pitched screeches, the gloomy fog instantly swallowed the endless stream of spiders. In the areas covered by the fog, one could vaguely see the cruel flapping of wings, claws, and beaks. Viscous liquid and broken limbs and organs constantly fell from the fog. They quickly shriveled, disintegrating into pieces of paper before they hit the ground. The intruders with malicious intentions were swiftly judged. Their limbs were ripped off, their carapaces were torn off, their eyes were pecked out, and their stomachs were torn apart. The venomous spirits attached to the origami wailed silently as they were swallowed up by the fog. Only the 9 hanging lights silently soared within the carriage, coldly collecting the scattered origin substances and casting them into an eternal dream. The holding candle crow coldly patrolled the battlefield, looking down at the battlefield. A staggering figure flashed by, and then quickly disappeared, hiding in the darkness. Under the raincoat, Quinn was already drenched in sweat. His face was pale, and he suppressed the urge to pant. He felt as if hundreds of bird beaks had suddenly burrowed into his brain, stirring up his brain. His vision began to darken. Even though they were origami, the spirits attached to them came from the army contract he had signed with the infernal realm. His origin substances were regularly raised, and there was a faint connection between them. This was the only way he could control them as he wished. But now, these crows' attacks were actually able to follow the connection between them and affect Quinn's body, transmitting the crushing pain to him. This caused him to feel fear from the bottom of his heart. The spider wave tactic, which had always been successful, had suddenly suffered such a setback. Very quickly, however, a mocking smile appeared on his face. Eat. Eat as much as you want. Eat as much as you want. Even if they haven't evolved into human-faced spiders yet and are still young, the origin substances in their bodies have already undergone a qualitative change and become extremely poisonous. The amount of origin substance produced by a single spider was enough to kill an entire building's worth of people. The more they ate, the faster they would die. Even though he didn't know what kind of strange species these crow were, there was no doubt that a lethal dose had already accumulated in their bodies. Perhaps even the person who raised them had already been infected. As he laughed coldly, he endured the pain and once again activated the spider wave. The sharp pain from the needles caused him to fall into a momentary daze. His movements couldn't help but slow down slightly. Countless thoughts rose and fell in his mind, colliding with each other. Holy! Boom! The mountain monarch roared, and its giant sword whistled through the air. It struck nothing but air. In an instant, Yuan's sword burst forth. After traveling a few dozen meters, it tore through the seats and floorboards like a hot knife through butter, nailing itself deep into the cabin's planks. Everyone was stunned and looked at her in astonishment. "What's wrong?" Lin Shurjo asked. "Was I mistaken?" The girl in the gray dress frowned, thinking back to the strange voice that had suddenly appeared in the cabin. She turned around and instructed, "Everyone return to your positions and follow the rules regarding abnormal situations. Before teacher returns, form groups and wait for rescue. Unless it's absolutely necessary, don't run around the cabin." As she spoke, she pulled out her giant sword and stood at the entrance of the cabin, holding the overly large sword and guarding the door. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief when they saw the slender figure standing out first. At this critical moment, someone had to stand up and make a difference. No matter who stood up to take on this responsibility, the others shouldn't be a hindrance at this time. The impetuous atmosphere in the cabin quickly dissipated. Peace was restored under the patrolling and hunting of the crows. When they came back to their senses, they began to treat the students who had been accidentally bitten by the spiders. Order was restored. Like a phantom, they swept past Yuan. Quinn's hand under his raincoat twitched, but he put it down, resentfully. He didn't do anything to the group of students. Instead, he looked at where Andrea was. Two curved blades silently slid out from the sheaths on his back and waist. Spiderwave tactic. After the spiders invaded the cabin, Andrea rummaged through the wreckage in front of her. She took out a pair of tweezers and picked up a piece of floral paper. She nodded in understanding. "Seems like an old friend." "You know him?" Weisher next to her asked. "Harley Quinn, the clown in the troupe, a very difficult guy." Andrea threw away the tweezers directly, got up and patted the dust on her hands. "He should have mixed into the cabin now. You should be careful. That guy is the Grand Master of the French Fencing Association. If you don't pay attention, it's easy to." Before her voice faded away, a sharp iron light pierced through the torn cabin panel like a meteor and flew toward her. Just like flowers blooming in an instant, the blade moved erratically, making it difficult to see the trajectory. but in the armpit, it slashed toward Andrea's throat. And the one faster than him was why sure. The banner appeared out of thin air and fell. The rolling darkness instantly expanded and swallowed everything around. The burial sanctuary descended here. The crow holding the candle rose from the darkness and flew down toward Harley Quinn. At the moment when the darkness swept, Quinn's vision turned black, and he couldn't help but twitch. A spasm of fear. There was a great panic rising from his consciousness, as if he once again saw the endless blood color rising rapidly with the fierce outline of the abyss. Thousands of evil eyes cast an indifferent glance at him. The scene from his nightmare appeared again. It shocked his consciousness, and after he reacted, he didn't hesitate and quickly retreated. The crow's blade-like wings had already torn his raincoat, leaving a deep cut on his arm. He staggered back and disappeared into the air with difficulty. The sound of the sand barrier breaking came, and it was obvious that it couldn't hold on for long. Quinn, who still had lingering fear, looked at the young man in the rolling darkness. His eyes were full of vigilance, so many origin substances, and he still didn't die. Soon, small eyes and deformed pieces of flesh quickly grew out of the itchy wound and answered his question. The abyss poison parasitized his wound and began to spread quickly. The other party was more poisonous than him. Harley Quinn gritted his teeth, pulled out the curved blade, and slashed. An arm separated from the arm, but when it fell to the ground, it turned into half a colorful sleeve. He was obviously seriously injured, and his face was getting paler. But when he raised his head, there was an exaggerated Roman mask on his face. The corners of the mask's mouth curled up, as if it was a perpetual playful smile. But under the mask, there was a murderous look in his eyes. In the narrow space of the carriage, there were so many students here. They were living hostages, which naturally restricted Andrea. Even if she could easily burn him to ashes with her terrifying firepower in a head-on confrontation, she absolutely couldn't use her power unscrupulously here. Therefore, the one who posed the greatest threat to him was that unfamiliar young man. If he guessed correctly, he was the one who summoned the crows. In his mind, he quickly compared countless stigmata information and finally locked onto the celestial genealogy. The characteristics of young Master Ming were too obvious. That banner was proof enough. Stigmata focused on auxiliary and servile types. There were probably more legions hidden in the darkness, but that was to say, once his legion was bypassed, the young man would be the easiest target here. On the mask, his smile became more and more ferocious. The curved sword spread out like wings under the raincoat. It flew up. Chapter 5:24. From stillness to sprinting, it only took an instant for it to soar to extreme speed. Harley Quinn's phantom appeared in the air for a moment, and then rushed into the bone-burying sanctuary. Even the darkness was temporarily torn apart by the two curved swords that were emitting a dazzling radiance. The fleeting enemy attacked again. Huai-Shi raised his hand, and the mountain ghost walked out of the darkness. The sinister old man who bore the brunt of the attack didn't even have time to react before he was cut into pieces by the two swords. Even Harley Quinn was stunned for a moment. He didn't expect the opponent to be so weak, but soon a sharp pain came from his back. The figure of the red gloves suddenly appeared, and the sacrificial knife pierced deeply into his heart. Then, in front of him, the solemn priest walked out of the darkness, holding a ferocious axe blade at his waist with both hands. He raised it and chopped down at his face, the footwork of the standard Roman heavy weapons. Pa! A soft sound. As the axe of wrath cut through, Harley Quinn had become a broken raincoat. Relying on the tactic of abandoning the sandbar veil, he achieved the effect of a substitute, and the real Harley Quinn had passed through the entanglement of the mountain ghost and jumped out of the whistling crows. He was now wearing a flowery robe. The red and green colors were inconspicuous and extremely strange. However, when he moved, the strange mask began to recite ancient poems and classics. The two curved swords were swung casually, and in an instant, he was in front of Huaishir. With a grim smile, the two curved swords chopped down. Then his heart was cold. Huaishir raised his hand expressionlessly, and the sword of virtue had pierced through his chest. That's it. Huaishir raised his head and asked. Harley Quinn's movements were sluggish, and he was stunned in place. Looking down, he saw the sword blade that pierced through his chest. Unbelievable. What's going on? What's this? What the hell happened? Why would a summoner F***king fight better than a Pokemon? Just now, in a split second, Huaishir had pulled out the sword of virtue right in front of him. She raised it and leveled it, easily parrying the two strange curved swords that crisscrossed at her. Then she pierced Harley Quinn's chest with brute force. It was as if Harley Quinn sent himself to him to be stabbed. The movement was so beautiful, like flowing water. It was simply intoxicating. One hit, Huaishir didn't hesitate, and the sword of virtue dissipated. Behind Harley Quinn, the red glove raised his foot and abruptly kicked Harley Quinn's leg, causing him to kneel on the ground. Huaishir took the axe of wrath from Van Helsing and aimed it at Zhang Zian's neck. Raise cut. Behead. There was a sudden sound. At the last moment, Harley Quinn had disappeared. Instead, there was a strong figure that broke in from outside the bone burial sanctuary. Suddenly appearing in the carriage, the man wearing high-top leather boots and an old-fashioned fur military hat strode forward with an exaggerated mask identical to Harley Quinn's. He pulled out a military knife from his waist, raised it, and saluted to Huaishir. This was the final declaration before the duel. The masked man, who looked like a military officer, stepped forward. Behind him, figures that looked exactly like him appeared. There was nothing fake about them. All of them were burly men who looked like real people. They wore masks that looked exactly like the military officer. 6. When the military saber slashed down on Huaishir, it burst out with a thunderous roar. The 7 officers lined up side by side, as if they were in the middle of a military drill. Their movements were uniform as they attacked Huaishir. The candle crows swooped down in an instant, and the flickering flame disappeared in a flash. When the officers broke through the barrier and slashed down with their sabers, the young man in front of them had unknowingly turned into a perplexed old man, dismembered by the knives. Behind them, a cold and solemn voice of praise rang out. Holy! Van Helsing slashed down with his axe. In the darkness, the red glove held the sacrificial knife and stabbed it into the back of an officer. From the back to the front, the blade protruded from the chest. Then, the officer silently turned into ashes. Along with the appearance of countless evil grinning shadows, young Arbiter Ming silently appeared in front of them with a banner in her hand. She swung the sword of virtue in her hand, parrying 3 military sabers that were slashing at her. Sparks flew. Young Arbiter Ming moved like a ghost in the bone burial sanctuary. Accompanied by the rise and fall of countless crows, she suddenly appeared and suddenly disappeared. When Yu's step was activated, there was no sound, and she had already appeared on the side of an enemy. She raised her hand and pierced. The blade pierced through the throat. She pulled horizontally. A head flew into the sky, and blood spurted out. But soon, the dead person also disappeared without a trace like a phantom. Then, 2 brand new officers walked out of the crowd and attacked Huaishir again without any hesitation or fear. Where did this Yan Qinga come from? Huaishir frowned. Without waiting for him to attack, he heard Andrea's voice. "Get out of the way." The shadow of the red dragon roared. In her hand, the plasma torrent that had been brewing for a long time had already roared toward the figures in the bone burial sanctuary. The dazzling lightning showed the pure brutality of physics. In the terrifying heat rising, all the enemies were burned to ashes. Only one figure staggered back and hid behind a middle-aged man in a scholar's robe. The middle-aged man in black waved his hand and easily collected the electric current. It gathered into a ball in his hand and quickly dissipated. Only the wild static electric field spread from here, and there was a crackling sound. "Doctor?" Andrea indifferently raised her eyebrows, looked away, and glanced at the embarrassed officer beside him. "And Colonel and Pandalong, together with Harley Quinn, this time your troop has really turned out in full force." At the end of the carriage, the embarrassed Harley Quinn sat on the ground, and the wound on his chest was difficult to heal. Beside him stood a man in a luxurious suit. His hands were adorned with rings of various colors. He looked extremely rich and luxurious. His hair was gray, and the mask on his face looked like a harsh old man. His expression was extremely arrogant, and he was the Pandalong that Andrea mentioned. And when Andrea called them a troop, Huaisher finally understood. Although he failed cultural classes all year round, at least the information from the astronomy club was enough to read. He naturally knew about this primitive miracle that had sprouted since ancient Rome. Harley Quinn sounded like a popular character in a comic, but in fact, tracing back to the etymology, it was the prototype of the title clown, coupled with the title doctor. Colonel and Pandalong, he had already understood the identity of the attacker. Just like the Birthdan Jingcho and the 12 zodiacs of the Dongsha Social Security Bureau, this was a special inheritance that had been passed down since ancient times. They originated from ancient Rome and used performances and stories as carriers to obtain correction values. A miracle born from the Roman masquerade. If understood in the traditional culture of Dongsha, Harley Quinn was ugly, the colonel was Wusheng, and the doctor and Pandalong were old students. However, Huaisher didn't know much about them. He only remembered that in modern times, with the division of Rome, their inheritance went to America. After being corrected by the American genealogy, it became a special type of stigmata created for special people. It didn't have the prerequisites and backroads of the path of sublimation. It appeared as an independent link, and it became more mysterious and hidden. He didn't expect to meet them here. "The Ivy League greets the two of you." The gentle doctor bowed to his opponents in a dignified manner. "I didn't expect that we would meet again in hell. The last time I met Professor Andrea was at the aerodynamics seminar, right? The last time I met you, I wanted to punch your sissy nose off. Are you here to say hello to me?" Andrea asked indifferently. "It seems that the competitor this time is you, right? The Ivy League, a loose and miscellaneous organization, dares to provoke the ivory tower. If I remember correctly, our school has always been in the lead in elemental transformation chemistry and abyss biochemistry." The doctor chuckled softly. "We have always been in the lead in chemical thermodynamics and polymer chemistry. Material physics is coming soon. What about the remaining subjects that money can't buy? If you can do academics by poaching people, the most advanced in the world is the magic gold bank. In the end, isn't it because you are weak? Can't you just admit that you are a chicken?" She paused for a moment, and her expression became cynical. "With all due respect, your new discovery in aerodynamics last time is a pile of useless garbage. In the ivory tower, it's not even worthy of a doctoral thesis. After combining those scraps, the thermodynamics of alchemy has become impure, and even Ms. Andrea has become arrogant." The doctor's tone quickly became sharp. It's because more and more people are tempted by these crooked methods that the academic atmosphere is so impetuous, isn't it? If the ivory tower doesn't have any sense of shame at all, it's better to buy a few kilograms of meat from the flesh factory. Do you want me to lend you some money? No, I'll feel bad if I take the money from your fake data and thesis to spend. Weisher stood behind and saw the two people in front of him quarreling inexplicably. He was confused. He looked back at Raymond, who walked out of the cockpit, and asked in a low voice, "What happened?" "Academic conflicts. Common. Raymond, who was carrying an oversized flail, grinned. "Let's wait until they finish quarreling and prepare to kill these sons of the asterisk cheese." The quarrel between the two people had spread from physics to all fields. The arrogance and disdain of the senior from the ivory tower collided with the disdain and anger of the Ivy League. At first, Weisher could still watch from the side, but when the other party mocked the ecology of the abyss, he couldn't help but fly into a rage. He rolled up his sleeves and pulled Beelzebub out of the bag. "What the F asterisk CK, say that again." When the power leveler came online, the fragrance from the Lord of the Flies instantly spread throughout the carriage. "Be careful, my cello is going to shovel back and forth on your mother's grave. One serenade is enough to send your whole family to their deaths. If you are not convinced, then let's practice. Believe it or not, after today, I can immediately teach my students how to use your ashes to feed dogs." Chapter 525. Enough! An old voice came from behind the professor. The old man, Pandalong, spoke in a hoarse voice, interrupting the boring quarrel between the two sides. It was obvious that he was the one in charge. Once he gave the order, even though the professor was unwilling, he didn't retort. This allowed Weisher to take advantage of the situation. The old man raised his head and looked at them indifferently. Finally, his gaze fell on Weisher. He nodded in understanding. "It seems that this is the new classical music teacher of the Ivory Tower, as expected of a former S-level member of the Heavenly Literature Association." "I am still one now. Thank you." Weisher added, "You forgot the titles of Disaster Musician, Abyss Cooking Demon, Legendary Investigator, and Prince of Paradise, as well as Jinling's Beheading King. In the future, when you introduce others, remember to introduce them all." As he spoke, he pulled out a golden document from his pocket. "Now, I suspect that this is a premeditated and organized terrorist attack against the Heavenly Literature Association. Please immediately kneel down with your hands behind your head and cooperate with the Heavenly Literature Association's investigation and judgment. Otherwise, I have the right to kill you on the spot." In Weisher's hand, a heavy revolver spun nimbly at her fingertips, the pitch-black muzzle sweeping past each of her opponents. His killing intent was drawn, but not released. "I've heard of the Heavenly Literature Association's reputation before." The old man shook his head unconcernedly. "However, Mr. Weisher, you don't think that just because you brought up the Heavenly Literature Association's name, do you? Also, I'm an investigator of the South American branch of the Heavenly Literature Association. Are you trying to scare me with a black letter?" "There's no need for a black letter. This is enough." Weisher raised his gun and pointed it at the old man's face. "Don't make me repeat myself. Put your hands behind your head and kneel down. Now, immediately." The answer to Weisher was a diamond that Pandalong spun nimbly between his fingers. It was about the size of a fist. A large amount of tyrannical origin substance was bound within it. One could faintly see the blazing light and lightning. It was enough to incinerate the entire train. "Are you sure you want me to let go?" Pandalong took a step forward and asked mockingly, "I don't think there's anything wrong with everyone dying together. I've lived long enough, but it's a pity that there are so many students on the bus." "Then let go." Huaisher's heart did not waver in the slightest. Instead, he revealed Brother Wutong's signature expression. Loosen one for me to see. Let's bet on whether you or I will die today. All right, Huaisher. In the end, Andrea said, let them go. In the silence, Huaisher stared at the old man's eyes indifferently. After a long time, he smiled and put away the pistol. I'm just joking. Why are you so nervous? Who doesn't know that the Prince of Paradise, Huaisher, is the most soft-hearted person? He can't stand to see others bully the old, weak, sick, and disabled. Go, go. Next time, come and play more often. Pandalong didn't say anything. He reached out and pressed on the doctor's body. All of a sudden, the figures of these people became illusory. At the last moment, as if by accident, the diamond actually fell out of his hand. He seemed to be careless as well. The gun in Huaisher's hand just happened to be raised and aimed at the old man's face. It just happened to misfire. Amidst the terrifying roar that shook the abyss, a tyrannical light burst out from the super-small trial device. The terrifying light beam that was enough to destroy the divine mark converged into a line and tore apart half of Pandalong's face. After penetrating the deck, it flew out diagonally. It seems that the sky was also cut by the sharp blade. The blazing light passed over the Huichengfire city, which had been left behind, and slowly dissipated. The screams stopped abruptly. They had disappeared without a trace. Before that, Raymond had already thrown the flail in his hand. The iron ball covered with barbs at the end of the chain suddenly opened a big mouth and swallowed the origin bomb that was about to explode. A muffled sound, thick black smoke came out of Raymond's mouth and nose. Cough, cough, cough. He coughed, wiped his snot, and gasped. This is just for show. Ha ha. But the smell is really strong. Huaisher's eyes widened. It was the first time he saw someone swallow a bomb alive and not die. He was shocked. Why was this guy's stomach so good? It's normal, it's normal. Raymond wiped his face and looked at the Lord of the Flies in Huaisher's hand greedily. Where did you buy this thing? Can you let me play with it? I'll just touch it. You're playing with your horse. Beelzebub was furious. Stinky brother, stop dreaming. Before it continued to spit out more fragrance, Huaisher hurriedly stuffed it back into the bag and smiled apologetically at Raymond. Sorry, it has a bad temper. I'll carve you. Before Huaisher could finish, he heard a sharp voice roaring angrily. It was the flail in Raymond's hand. Hammerhead, which was covered with barbs, opened its mouth and began to curse. However, before it could finish its sentence, Redmond grabbed a table and stuffed it into its mouth. The two looked at each other, and their awkward expressions became more subtle. They patted each other's shoulders to show sympathy. Life wasn't easy. It's a pity that these bastards ran away. Before comforting the students and cleaning up the mess, Huaisher couldn't help but sigh. It's okay. Andrea calmly blew out the flame on her fingertips. Her voice was filled with malice. You're making it sound like only the Ivy League would attack. Buffed. When I went to bomb those little bitches at Imperial University, they were still in preschool. Huaisher's face twitched. Is the academic world so crazy when it comes to persecuting each other? Above the endless sea of fire, the eternal black clouds suddenly shook, and a huge scarlet airship broke through the clouds. In the living room inside the airship, there was a flash. The members of the troupe suddenly appeared. Then Pandalong fell on his back, and hot blood gushed out from the charred wound on his head. The mask was broken. Serious injury. No, it should be said, he was not far from death. It was just one blow. The scholars who rushed to rescue him suddenly gasped. If they didn't come back quickly, he would have died in half a minute. Don't panic. Leave a few people to give me first aid. Harley Quinn also needs surgery. Pandalong, who should have died immediately, now ordered, Doctor, you and the colonel go and report to the vice principal. The other teachers should also be waiting. Don't delay. Since the ivory tower has asked for reinforcements, it's not enough to rely on our second batch of reinforcements. We should immediately organize the third batch of reinforcements. In any case, the Twilight Village can't fall into the hands of the ivory tower. Otherwise, our years of efforts will be in vain. In the end, his expression became gloomy. Also, remind the vice principal to be vigilant and prevent the ivory tower from attacking. The dipping pen trembled and moved away from the picture. A face looked down and drew closer. It furrowed its brows. The word attack in attack is written incorrectly. Forget it. I'll just make do with it. It's time for the exciting little monster to make its debut. So, the original draft that had just been drawn was taken off the drawing board. Just in the midst of the boiling lava, not far away, the sound of an airship whistling past came from above and gradually went away. On the stone mountain, the artist who drew the scene hummed a song and flipped through his material book. His fingers swept across the settings of the huge monsters one by one, and finally stopped on a monster that looked like a wolf and a dragon. Aha, the inspiration for the Night of the Witch. This is it. Kelly Christian, the head of the oil painting class from the Ivory Tower and a temporary guest cartoonist, nodded happily and picked up the brush again. So, in the violent sea of fire in the distance, a pair of huge eyes slowly opened. It was hungry. Since then, no more accidents happened. The only problem was that the depth of the hell of hesitation deepened, and many students had allergic reactions. However, this was not a big deal for the Ascenders. It was just like altitude sickness, and they would be fine after resting for a day or two. If that did not work, they could just take an oxygen tank and take some medicine. In this way, about 40 hours later, the train smoothly passed through the 2 gates and the road signs and appeared in the dilapidated temporary station. They had arrived early, but for some reason, after stopping for a long time, the platform was still empty. Under the noon sun, there was no one. The village of Dusk was exceptionally quiet at this moment. Only dust silently sprinkled down from the cracks of the windshield overhead, dancing in the sunlight. No one came to pick them up, and there was no one left in the entire station. And here, the deep interference was too serious, and the radio system could not contact the people in the division. For a moment, no one knew what to do. They were a little lost and hesitant. In the eerie silence, only the decadent and bleak scene outside the window could be seen. The entire station seemed to have been abandoned. Even after Raymond shouted a few times with the loudspeaker, no one responded. They seemed to have been abandoned. When they thought that this was the hell of hesitation, all the reinforcements felt a burst of uneasiness from the bottom of their hearts. And when Weischer volunteered to get off the train to investigate, he was stopped by Andrea. "Wait a minute, look at that." Andrea raised her hand and pointed at the hanging sign outside the window. As if afraid that they could not see it, several signs were either hanging or inserted everywhere on the platform, but most of them had begun to fade, and it was difficult to distinguish the words on them. They could only guess and analyze. "Please don't get off the train." The words "don't get off the train" were specially marked in red and bold. There was even a stone tablet next to it with the same words written on it. They couldn't wait to paste this line of words on their faces, but it had been too long since they had been maintained. Those signs were either dim and faded or directly decayed and broken. There were not many that could be recognized, and only a few could be vaguely seen. "No matter what happens, don't get off the train. Please pull down the curtains and maintain the temperature and artificial light. Don't get off the train. Pull down the curtains. Maintain the temperature. Maintain the internal lighting." Several warning slogans were written directly on the ground, but only faint traces were left, and they were almost indistinguishable. Only the words on the stone tablet were still clearly visible. In addition to repeatedly emphasizing these few words, there was only one last solemn exhortation left, waiting for dusk. After the third watch, thank you for the reward, the second Silver Alliance. I was so happy that I couldn't sleep last night, and I beg for monthly votes. Chapter 526. Waiting for dusk. Amidst the silence, the three people in the driver's seat glanced at each other, their brows furrowed. Weisher poked his head out. Through the window, he could see the dilapidated train station outside, as well as the sunlight that seeped through the cracks in the canopy. It was unclear whether the sunlight was a natural phenomenon, a reflection of the abyss, or some kind of terrifying miracle or calamity. But generally speaking, this should be the time when the sunlight was at its brightest. If there really was a day and night cycle here, then dusk would probably take a long time to arrive. But the question was, why wait for dusk? Also, why was there not a single person in the newly constructed train station? Andrea muttered to herself for a long time before suddenly asking, has there been any response to our signal? There's too much noise, and the origin substances here are weakening too quickly. Normal communication methods won't work. In addition, the campus is in a state of silence for a long time, so there's no guarantee that they'll respond to us. Raymond said, we can only wait. In other words, after leaving the ivory tower, they had arrived in the infernal realm, but they had mysteriously lost contact with the campus known as the Iron Crystal Constellation. In the past, when they went on a long trip, they would find that the gates were tightly shut, and they wouldn't be able to stay in a guest house even if they had a letter of recommendation. They couldn't even make a phone call. They could only feel the strange gazes from the empty streets. Only now did they realize that they knew nothing about this place. Could it be that something happened to the Iron Crystal Constellation? Weisher estimated the amount of dust and decay outside the window. He felt that no one had been in charge of this place for at least a month or two, and he couldn't help but feel wary. In the worst-case scenario, the Iron Crystal Constellation might have been fine before they left, but then be gone by the time they arrived. But for something this big, the school wouldn't let them continue to jump into the hole. Even if Russell was crazy enough to arrange Weisher's death, he wouldn't have tied so many people to him. Compared to that, he was more willing to believe that they had encountered some unknown undercurrent while diving and had accidentally traveled back in time to a few years later. In the infernal realm, anything that was possible or impossible could happen. It was just a matter of probability. Silently recalling the abyssal survival manual that Lucian had given her, Weisher was still at her wits' end. Most of the time, no matter how many ways to deal with the situation, it was useless. When faced with a situation, one had to make a decision. Otherwise, they could only stay where they were and wait for death. What if a Kuan came down from the sky and ate the station while they were waiting here? This was only the easiest way to die. In the unknown and unfamiliar hell, no one knew if their actions would bring about deeper disasters. Sometimes one could only choose the lesser of two evils and drink as little as possible when one was dying of thirst. Seal the carriage and install the overhead armor. Prioritize maintaining the operation of the depth balancer. The leader, Andrea, raised her head and was the first to make a decision. I remember that Raymond brought your car with you. It's a support vehicle. We need drivers in hell too. Raymond stubbed out his cigarette and asked, should we let the students go up? The instruments are all stuffed inside. It will be a little crowded. It's more spacious than a coffin. Don't worry so much. Let's do it, Andrea said. If we stay outside, we may not be able to help more at the critical moment. Do we have to wait? Weisher asked, and finally looked at the stone tablet. Could it be a trick of the Ivy League, or are we in the wrong place? Sneaking into the abyss requires the dual guidance and identification of the lighthouse and the destination beacon. The Ivy League may be able to interfere with the operation of the lighthouse, but without the determination to be sent to the Yellow Pages by the Astronomy Society, they would never dare to do anything in such a critical place. Moreover, with their technical ability, it would be 300 years before they could crack and imitate the beacon of the Ivory Tower. Andrea took a last look at the stone tablet and told him the stone tablet is the work of the Grand Master. If it weren't for him, I'm afraid that the stone tablet and the surrounding signs wouldn't have been left. Don't worry about the authenticity. Before we entered Hell, we had already sent the arrival signal from the outside. As volunteers who don't know the specific situation, it's better to follow the instructions of the Grand Master. The Grand Master was the highest honor given by the Stone Cauldron Society after reaching the peak of alchemy. However, generally speaking, after reaching this level, it was still uncertain whether or not the Stone Cauldron Society would learn alchemy. It was as if the creators never cared about the awards that would make the eyes of scholars turn red. No one cared about those insignificant praises. There were only 11 Grand Masters in the world today, and there was only one in the Ivory Tower. He was Mikhail Ivanovich Zaitsev, the man who had led the construction of the world's largest crystal furnace 31 years ago. He was also the person in charge of this Hell's subdivision, and the person who was directly in charge and the builder of the Iron Crystal Throne. In the catalog of relics at the border, there were more than 400 alchemy recipes that originated from his theories and inspirations. The summary of crystal material smelting and quenching that could not be bypassed by all the research of source materials came from his hands. And this thing was just a draft that he casually wrote when he was 29 years old and waiting for his ex-wife to put on makeup. Now, Weischer's alchemy was not even able to enter the field of research of other people 40 years ago. If such a big shot wanted them to wait here, then they had to wait. They had to wait even if the sky fell and the earth cracked. It had to be said that although the current situation was strange and complicated, after hearing the name of the Grand Master from Andrea, Weischer was still relieved. It was equivalent to finding the strategy in a horror game with no chance of survival. Don't get off the train, pull down the curtains, maintain the temperature in the room, and keep the lights on. Then wait for dusk. Soon, layers of armor emerged from the body of the train with a low sound, overlapping and expanding, directly wrapping the entire train in it like an iron turtle. The slender train shrunk by almost a third of its length. All the students also followed the instructions to the warehouse and entered Raymond's car. The armor isolated the inside and outside, adding another layer of protection to Raymond's truck, and the depth balancer maintained the depth of the car to resist the erosion of the abyss. Under the protection of the 3 Matryoshka dolls, as long as Weischer and the other 2 leaders were still alive, nothing would happen to them. The next step was to wait patiently. They sat in front of the monitor, staring at the decadent station outside. Although there was a hint from the Grand Master, their hearts were inevitably heavy, and they did not dare to relax, let alone chat. But the more they waited, the more Weischer felt that something was wrong. Time. He lowered his head, took out his mobile phone, and looked at the time. If he remembered correctly, it had been 5 hours since they had arrived here, and the sun outside had not changed at all. Not even the slightest bit of decline. He was stunned for a moment, and his heart was shocked. There was definitely a problem with the day and night in this place. There was probably no way to apply the 24-hour system here, and it was possible that there was a polar day and polar night, 3 to 4 months of days, and half a year of nights. Dusk, however, only had a few short days of time left. Just as he raised his head and was about to speak, his body suddenly stiffened in place, as if he had fallen into an ice cellar and could not move. Only the tumbling premonition of death rose from his spine and froze him. On the monitor directly in front of him, a dull face had unknowingly appeared. It was like a swollen face after drowning, without any characteristics or expression. Only an abnormally large right eye took up a third of the space on his face. Droplets of water dripped down from the hair stuck to her forehead. It was as if it could see Huaishir behind the monitor. Through the camera and the monitor, it stared straight at him. Huaishir's face was gradually reflected in the lifeless eye. It saw him. In the silence, Huaishir also looked back calmly. In his hand, the sharp steel crystals rapidly multiplied, rubbing against each other, bursting out sparks, and a sharp, almost roaring, low sound rang out. Under the gaze of that, Huaishir pressed on the sword, motionless. However, the muscles under his skin rippled slightly like flowing water. It was as if a bowstring was gradually tightened. A numbing, itching, and cracking pain appeared on his face. The eye stared at him, and as his skin peeled off inch by inch, the muscles underneath seemed to have come alive. They left his Achilles tendon and danced slowly, caressing his face. The chill was approaching inch by inch. Huaishir held his breath. The veins on the hand holding the sword bulged. In the silence of death, he did not blink. The sword of virtue roared angrily, but it could not stop the gray color from spreading from Huaishir's skin. Waves of coldness emerged from the bottom of his lungs, as if he had been thrown into a frozen river, and a viscous liquid mixed with broken ice and blood flowed out from his mouth and nose. On the display screen, the sluggish face lifted slightly, and the corners of his mouth slowly curved into a stiff arc. It seemed to be smiling. It was at that moment that a blazing light jumped out of the narrow cockpit out of thin air. It was as if the scorching sun had suddenly descended here. Huaishir stood up, took a step forward, and took a step forward. In the thin body, the silent young arbiter of life's stigmata suddenly shook, and a disaster miracle from the abyss unfolded in the vast and mighty flow of source substance. After a long period of accumulation, the sword roared, and thunder burst out from the tremor. On the sharp blade, a blazing light that could not be looked directly at appeared. The deathly silence was shattered by this soul-stirring low note. Under the transcription of the performance method, the prelude of the Fifth Symphony was unveiled. It was just like a sudden knock on the door in the vast and long night. It was fate. Fate was knocking on the door. As Huaishir waved his arm, the sound of fate burst out. The blazing light flashed and disappeared. Chapter 527. When the first syllable was struck, an ear-piercing sound suddenly exploded in his ears. Immediately afterwards, everything in front of him seemed to disappear like an illusion, including the frozen blood flowing from his nose and mouth, the deathly gray covering his skin, and the distorted skin on his face. Everything disappeared under the slash of the sword. The long, nightmarish trance finally ended. Huaishir was still sitting in his original position, not moving at all. Nothing had changed, as if everything that had just happened was just a short dream. Only in front of him, on the display screen, a straight crack silently appeared. Then it fell cleanly to the side. The sound of something shattering could be heard. Huaishir was finally drenched in sweat, and he couldn't help but gasp for breath. When he raised his eyes, he saw Raymond waiting for him, as well as Andrea behind Raymond. She raised her hand, her fingertips slightly warm. Gritting her teeth, she pointed at Huaishir's head. He had already been in a daze for an hour. It was as if he had been petrified, without any reaction. Now that he had finally made a move, they were afraid that the colleague in front of them was no longer the Huaishir they were familiar with. I swear, Huaishir immediately opened his mouth, and recited the oath of the astronomy meeting in front of them. Then, he pulled out the astronomy meeting's identification card and inserted an origin substance into it. A faint golden light rose from the metal insignia on the card's cover. Verification complete. If there was anything in this world that could not be faked, it could only be proven by the astronomy meeting, which had been cross-verified by the 3 major blockades. This was perhaps the greatest benefit of being the astronomy meeting's lackey. At the very least, they didn't have to worry about being impersonated. Damn, that scared me to death. Raymond tossed the flail aside and let out a long sigh. Andrea wiped the sweat off her forehead and returned to her chair. What exactly happened? After Huaisher described the scene that he had seen in his imagination, Andrea and Raymond fell silent. The two of them glanced at each other, and their expressions immediately became ugly. What happened? The person you saw should be Assistant Professor Condra, Andrea said dryly. As far as I know, he is the manager of this temporary station. Her expression gradually became gloomy. I originally wanted to introduce you to each other, but now it seems that there is no need. It seems that Assistant Professor Condra is very welcoming of me as a new colleague. Huaisher scratched his face. There was still an illusion of itchiness and a trace of pain. Huaisher felt that there were still some scales on his face, but in fact, it was just a psychological shadow left behind. Raymond changed the monitor in silence. Looking at the unchanged train station, he suddenly asked, "Do we still have to wait a little longer?" Andrea was silent for a long time before she said, "Wait." With that, she got up and walked to the warehouse behind her. "I'll go check on the students. I hope they're all right." Huaisher closed his eyes, but soon opened them again. His expression became strange. "No need." He coughed awkwardly. "They have already started to play the game of king. Well, it's quite lively." The inside and outside of the truck in the warehouse were all under the surveillance of his legion. While waiting for a long time, the students gradually felt uneasy. A certain unknown little 19, who was always ready, took advantage of everyone's impatience and smiled as he took out a deck of cards. He opened a small notebook in his mind and was ready to record the secrets of each student. In any case, the atmosphere was much more peaceful because of this. Everyone even had a good time, except for a few unlucky people who were accidentally poisoned by truth or dare. Later, he would let Yuan beat him up. He had to teach this guy a lesson. At the same time, he saw the ray of sunlight falling through the gap of the sunshade on the monitor, quickly dimming and shifting. He couldn't help but get up and take a closer look. Time seemed to be speeding up. It passed quickly, and in just an instant, it turned from blazing to fading. The dim yellow light of the setting sun appeared. It was dusk. At the same time, the whole silent world seemed to come alive. The deathly silence disappeared. Outside the station, a rustling sound sounded, followed by a roar in the distance. A huge shadow spread its wings and swept past the canopy above their heads. The decadence and strangeness that originally filled every inch of the air quickly faded away. The whole world seemed to be reborn in this ruin full of holes. Even in the cracks of the platform outside the window, several thumb-sized bugs crawled out of the soil, spread their wings, and flew around the station. Huaisher heard the faint roar of the propeller in the distant sky. "This is Muller. August Muller. We have received your signal. Tuna, please answer." Repeat, "This is August Muller. Tuna, please answer." In the intercom of the cockpit, there was a burst of harsh electric current and a rustling sound. And finally, a voice sounded. Until now, Huaisher knew that the train he was on was called Tuna. Soon, after the signal was verified, Raymond answered, and a figure swung down and landed on the ground. Then, there was a huge iron box. The newcomer was wearing a thick black coat that looked like a protective suit. He dragged the metal box, and rushed straight into the station. Then he gave each of the 3 teachers an umbrella. Yes, it was indeed an umbrella. No matter how he looked at it, it didn't look like anything else. Keep it first. We will explain on the way. August was very fast. After looking up at the obstructing sunshade overhead, he took out the intercom and said a few words. With a roar, the huge sunshade fell apart, with countless steel pipes and brackets falling off. Huaishur and the others finally caught a glimpse of the entire sky of the village of dusk. It was an orange-yellow. It was like a paper shell, painted with colors and covered on top. There was no change at all. It was so rigid that it made people unhappy. In the hurricane, the huge ornithopter flapped its 16 wings, lowered its altitude, and dropped dozens of ropes. After an emergency installation by other workers, they were fixed on the train. Take it away, take it away, take it all away. August urged loudly. Don't leave a single piece of iron behind, and then prepare to destroy the platform. We've already met Kant, Andrea abruptly said. August was stunned, and then turned his head in astonishment. He looked at them and could not understand. It was as if he was asking, then why are you still alive? Raymond and Andrea pointed at Huaishur. Huaishur shrugged. What is going on? Andrea asked, why did Chandra become like that? And why is there no one guarding the station? Where is the iron crystal? I have to say that you came too early. August's expression became complicated. Now, we have no manpower to maintain the station except for the iron crystal. Didn't you see Chandra leaving the iron crystal and wandering outside of dusk? He will become like this. Time is of the essence, Professor Andrea. We should go. Hurry up. If we are 5 minutes late, we will not be able to catch up with the rotation, and we will have to divert to another unmanned outpost to spend the night. He quickly stuffed several ropes into their hands, took out the walkie-talkie, and said a few words. The huge ornithopter in the sky began to rise rapidly. It directly pulled the tuna train into the sky, together with them. Until now, when they crossed the wall, Huaishur saw the entire Dusk Village. He finally understood what Augeas meant by rotation. Yes, the entire Dusk Village was rotating. It was as if countless disorderly buildings were casually piled up in one place and then left, leaving everything to become a scene of devastation hundreds of years later. As far as the eye could see, half of it was a messy city, and the other half was completely collapsed ruins. The layers of buildings and ruins were stacked on top of each other, forming a small mountain from the outside to the inside. However, after being abandoned for an unknown period of time, there was still a huge structure slowly operating under those buildings. Thick smoke could be seen continuously spewing out from huge chimneys. When one listened carefully, one could hear the roar echoing deep in the earth. After the earth cracked in some places, the slowly operating steel structures below were exposed. Huge gears stirred the rivers, causing surging torrents to sweep across. And places like heat sinks were constantly blowing out terrifying hot wind, rolling up bursts of sandstorms and hurricanes in the dry desert. The whole hell was like a machine that had gone out of control. After it was out of control, it ran on its own, causing a chain of topographical changes all the time, from the outside to the inside. The entire out-of-control city was divided into more than a dozen rings of different sizes. Some were fast, some were slow, and some were clockwise, and some were counterclockwise. They surrounded the tower in the middle, which was shrouded by countless huge mechanical structures. It was the top of the tower. Like the sun, it emitted the dim light of the setting sun, illuminating everything. When the sun set, the city, which had been dead all day long, instantly came alive. One could vaguely see countless hell mutants of various sizes crawling nimbly and quickly in the ruins. Some of them noticed the ornithopters flying in the sky and raised their heads to let out a series of high-pitched cries. Do you see? Dusk is the safest time here. It is also the time when these damned things are most active. We have to move faster. Otherwise, the iron crystal base might be moved to the other side of the city. Following Augeas' words, the giant ornithopter in the sky threw an iron ball on the ground as if it was laying an egg. It quickly rose into the sky, riding a hurricane and rushing into the distance. When the iron ball fell into the station, a terrifying flame soared into the sky and swallowed everything. Such a ruthless way of cleaning was an eye-opener for Huaishur. It should be known that the location of the station was the easiest place to enter and exit from the outside world. Now that it had been destroyed so ruthlessly, he was afraid that even the escape route was cut off. But when the raging flames dissipated, the charred ruins began to shake violently. It was as if time had turned back. After a few seconds, an identical station appeared in the same place. Huaishur even saw Assistant Kondra's figure among them. He was standing at the door. There was no light in his dull eyes as he watched them leave. His bloated face moved a little, and his lips opened and closed silently. It was as if he was welcoming them again. He smiled. When Huaishur blinked, the smile quickly disappeared. Only the chilling horror remained on his back. It seems that the Grand Master was right. The original cleaning method was not useful at all. Augeas stared at the station he had built with his own hands expressionlessly. Soon, he withdrew his gaze and said indifferently, "That place has been completely assimilated by hell." After rewriting the outline, he could not help but burst into tears. Goodbye, my abyss rats. Goodbye, my million poisons contest. Also, at the request of the readers, this book has opened a League Master Group. There is an exclusive customer service, Little Wind and Moon Love, to provide one-on-one service for the good brothers and sisters of the League Masters. Dear brothers and sisters who have not joined the group, please enter the V group through the introduction to understand in detail. Chapter 528. Assimilation. Augeas' words caused Huaishur to fall into silence. He couldn't help but feel a chill under the yellow setting sun. It was even more terrifying than solidification. It was the phenomenon that sublimators feared the most. After leaving the Silver Sea, the sublimator's origin substance transformed from a dissipated state into a soul. While they were resistant to the abyss, they also lost the protection of the Silver Sea. It was like water vapor evaporating from the sea-forming clouds, unable to control themselves in front of the fierce wind. Even with the protection of the sacred mark, the disasters that could be seen everywhere in hell were sometimes still unable to protect themselves. Compared to solidification, which was 1 in a million, assimilation was often the outcome of most explorers. Eroded by the precipitation of hell, their consciousness and souls were eternally bound in hell, gradually becoming shapes and forms that even they themselves could not understand. They wailed day and night, but no one listened. They looked forward to death, but death was far away. Most explorers were very happy when they killed, whether it was the enemy or themselves. Compared to those endings that were worse than death, death was simply as beautiful as a dream. Kondra was with me at that time. Augeas suddenly spoke in the fierce wind. Huaishur turned around and only heard his calm voice. I was luckier than him. Otherwise, there might have been 2 people welcoming you there today. Huaishur did not speak. He stepped on the roof of the car, hanging on to the rope by the safety buckle. He lowered his head and looked at the ground sweeping past in the fierce wind below. Whether it was the desert or the dense forest between layers of ruins, their faces were revealed. Roars could be vaguely heard one after another. It was as if the time to hunt had arrived. Those mutants that had been lurking for a long time were madly fighting in one place. As far as the eye could see, There were traces of fierce hunting and fighting everywhere. Fierce, cold, and efficient. Once they succeeded, they quickly dragged their prey back to the ruins of their habitat. It was as if they didn't want to stay outside for even a second. The world went from static to boiling in just a few minutes. It could be foreseen that after the boiling ended, it would probably return to dead silence. Dusk. Is dusk like this every day? Huaishur asked. Although there are some differences, it's almost the same, Ogiest answered. Only at this time does this place look like hell. What about other times? It's like the basement of hell. Ogiest thought for quite a while, then seriously told a lame joke. However, Huaishur didn't laugh at all. Huaishur suddenly realized something as he looked at the tragic scene below him. Wait a minute. Are we going to be all right if we just fly across the sky like this? He turned his head and looked behind him at the flock of birds that were faintly chasing after them. They looked like falcons or something else, but their bodies were covered in layers of mold and various malformed organs of unknown purpose. They followed closely behind the ornithopter from afar, but soon they changed their direction and pounced on the insects below. Don't worry, those things won't follow us. Augustine shrugged calmly. Because there are things in the sky that are even more terrifying than them. What the hell? Before Huaishur could ask for more details, she saw the tower in the center of the city tremble. Dozens of chaotic red light beams shot out from the giant sphere at the top of the tower and landed on the ornithopter, retracting as soon as they touched it. Then, in the sphere that was glowing with sunlight, a cold eye slowly opened. It looked at them. The earth rumbled. The silent ruins trembled. Then, countless buildings flipped over, revealing a dense forest of anti-aircraft artillery positions. Damn, how could there be such a thing in hell? Did they break into a military base? Huaishur's eyes almost popped out. He only had time to take a breath of cold air. It added a negligible amount of carbon emissions to this place. Thunder roared and soared into the sky. Countless terrifying flames burst out like flowers. With Huaishur's dynamic vision, after focusing, he could even see how the air was turbulent like water and how the flames spread. In the darkness, cannonballs that were shaped like crossbows and engraved with countless alchemy runes soared into the sky. Wrapped in a terrifying and vicious curse, those cannonballs left behind green traces that looked like thousands of hands reaching out from the ground and grabbing at them from all directions. The ornithopter suddenly rose in altitude. The huge skeleton seemed to be roaring and crying and rose hundreds of meters in an instant. Huaishur's vision turned dark, but it was useless. It only increased the distance between them and the ornithopter, which delayed them for less than half a second. And in this half a second, along with the movement of the earth, a ferocious silhouette suddenly appeared in the approaching sandstorm in the distance. The storm shook. Then, a stream of light rushed toward them, blocking the countless cannonballs and the ornithopter. It quickly disintegrated, causing the gray fog to expand and spread in the storm, forming a lead-black cloud. In the midst of it, a miracle from hell was triggered. Countless alchemy reactions that made Huaishur dizzy collided one after another, causing a qualitative change, forming a phenomenon that Huaishur could not understand at all. Once all the cannonballs flew into it, they quickly disappeared. They were melted, like salt falling into the sea. In just a few seconds, all the cannonballs disappeared. And under the decay, the gray clouds also began to degrade rapidly, turning into a pungent mottled rain that fell to the ground. A rusty greenish-bronze color spread from where the rain fell. Among it, plants cast in bronze grew rapidly, with sharp edges and corners, reflecting the iron light. At this point, how could Huaishur not know that it was the Grand Master who had made a move? When he raised his head and looked at the gradually opening sandstorm, he finally caught a glimpse of the iron crystal constellation. It was on an undulating sand dune, like a blade falling from the sky, from the top of the ruins of a building to the middle, and was stuck, and the other end was tilted in the air in a way that did not conform to the laws of gravity. Relying on a precarious point, it was tilted high in the air. That was a submarine. The corner of Huaishi's eyes twitched. He narrowed his eyes and looked carefully. No matter how he looked, he felt that this thing was a F*King submarine. It fell from the sky like a traffic accident, smashed into the ruins, and maintained an abnormal tilted position. The entire iron crystal constellation was a giant submarine, and on the submarine's body there were countless layers of alchemy arrays. The arrays extended in the air, intertwined with each other, and gradually disappeared. But the air became viscous like the sea. Everything around was forced into a low-gravity environment like the bottom of the sea. Occasionally, some sand and dust would slowly rise into the air, and then slowly fall to the ground. However, all the birds and other insects that were accidentally sucked into it were instantly crushed by the terrifying pressure hidden within. The place where it was located had turned into the deep sea. Now, as the ornithopter rapidly approached, it began to float rapidly. As the outermost layer of the array made contact, a huge gap opened in the middle of the submarine. Dozens of workers climbed out and skillfully put the train into the submarine under the command of the radio. Then, the huge ornithopter folded its wings, contracted and folded inwards. Finally, when it slid down the rails, it had shrunk into a solid iron cabinet more than 4 meters long. At the entrance of the iron crystal constellation, Andrea landed and said to Raymond, "You're in charge of the inventory and docking of the supplies. Then let Martin contact the people here and settle the students." Huaishi frowned. "Am I not the one who's going?" He did not suspect that Martin would seize the opportunity to seize power or make trouble for his students. He was just a little worried that Martin would mess things up. "Don't you have 2 students to help you?" Andrea waved her hand and said, "This is hell. There are no underage protection laws. Even children should come in handy. Besides, Martin just doesn't like to communicate with people. As an approved member of the teaching and research office, he can handle these things." "What about me?" Huaishi asked. Andrea's footsteps paused for a moment, and she turned back to look at him. "You're going to meet the Grand Master with me." The interior of the iron crystal constellation was not as cramped as the outside thought. Although the space was still limited after the expansion of alchemy and could not be wasted, at least it was not so cramped that people could not straighten their backs. As a mobile branch of the research institute, there was basically no lack of equipment and protection inside. Even in hell, it was enough to ensure safety. After passing the verification and inspection and entering the iron crystal constellation, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Thinking back to the long period of fear, they once again felt the danger of hell. While the others were relaxing and preparing to eat, take a shower, and go to sleep, Huaishi had already followed Andrea into the core of the iron crystal constellation. They went up the inclined elevator and went straight to the ship's bridge. In the internal test of the iron crystal constellation, there seemed to be a constant level of gravity. Even though they could see the slanted scenery outside through the porthole, inside, they still felt that they were standing firmly on the ground. There was no abnormality at all. Huaishi suspected that there was already a prototype of a mobile border inside the iron crystal constellation. It looked like a submarine was just a layer of shell. The inside and outside were 2 completely different places. The ivory tower had the money and the ability to do this. As long as they were in the iron crystal constellation, it was equivalent to being protected by the framework of the Creator. all the corrosion and strange phenomena of hell could not invade. Even if they were in hell that was constantly changing, they could still ensure the basic safety. And in the heavy internal defense and tight security, there were also countless laboratories and production lines that could respond appropriately to any changes. Not to mention, there was a Grand Master guarding here. If he was not afraid of his crow's mouth, Huaisher would have said that this time they could definitely win without any worries. But how could that old bastard Russell be so kind? There were definitely more problems waiting for him. The final door opened in front of him. He walked into the ship's bridge. Chapter 529. As soon as they entered the bridge, they were greeted by a solemn atmosphere. Under the projection formed by the convergence of countless changing values, there was a huge steel statue. There were already a few people waiting there, as if they were having an impromptu meeting. Seeing Ogiest bring Andrea and Huaisher in, someone waved and motioned for them to come over. It could be seen that this place was not very bureaucratic. Although the division of responsibilities was clear, most of the time, everyone was very casual about unimportant matters. This might be related to the excessive idealism of the ascendants. Everyone did not revere and respect power, and would not inexplicably lower their heads in crucial areas because of this. Moreover, those who could enter the Abyss exploration team generally did not care about their lives. If they did not care about their lives, why would they care about this? Even if he was one of the most powerful people in the entire Iron Crystal constellation, Ogiest still did not seem nervous or excited. He just calmly reported to the middle-aged man, "The support from the Academy has arrived at the Iron Crystal constellation, but the assimilation rate of the station has increased, so it can only be temporarily abandoned." That guy Khandra, the middle-aged man, sighed and did not say anything. He shook hands with Andrea. "Long time no see, Professor Andrea. It must have been hard for you to come all the way here." "It's my duty. And this." He looked behind Andrea. "A new face that I have never seen before." Huaisher, the main lecturer of classical music appreciation in the teaching and research room, a newcomer who works as Miss Andrea's assistant. Huaisher nodded reservedly. She looked around, trying to identify the great grandmaster in the crowd. The middle-aged man with a dignified expression? Is that a smiling lady? The taciturn old man with a harsh expression? Or the cold young man in the corner who did not say a word? In the short and tense communication meeting, no one introduced him. Here, no one treated him as a VIP who could not be neglected. To be exact, even Huaisher himself did not take himself seriously. Where was this place? Who was he? Even if he had a little bit of fame, how famous could he be compared to anyone here? Even if he was very powerful and good at fighting, how could it be compared to the miracle of destroying the Hell Cannon? Other than the few days he spent in the easy difficulty of Yamatai under the protection of the creation framework, did he have any other experience or resume worth mentioning? Even Tier 3 players were barely worth mentioning here. They were slightly stronger than the students who came here to work as free laborers, but their usefulness was still limited. In terms of usefulness, even Raymond, who was the driver, was better than him. The reason why Andrea had brought him in was probably because Huaisher was the principal's secretary. He was slightly qualified to know these secrets and was just helping a newcomer. Since that was the case, he should speak less, do less, watch more, and listen more. Keep a low profile and don't cause trouble for yourself. He leaned against the statue behind Andrea and quietly listened to their conversation. Supplies, food supplies, and personnel losses. The usage and preparation speed of the inventory, the rotation of personnel, and the research cycle. In this almost daily meeting, everyone simply communicated and reported to each other so that the others could have a rough idea of the departments and fields that they were responsible for. In the end, Weisher realized that even the grandmasters did not appear here. The chief engineer was in charge of the central engine and was also the first officer. The exploration team leader was in charge of external exploration and internal security. The chief engineer was in charge of managing supplies and internal coordination. The ship's doctor was in charge of ensuring the physical and mental health of the crew. The lighthouse observer was in charge of navigation and communications. The production line manager was in charge of manufacturing and maintenance. There were even representatives of alchemists and scholars. Also, there was Andrea, who had brought reinforcements and would be assisting in the maintenance of the internal framework of the Iron Crystal constellation. The 8 people here could be said to be the representatives of various aspects of the Iron Crystal constellation. They were rare elites and talents in the entire region. At the same time, they were also the explorers of the abyss. When Andrea brought the bad news about the Ivy League during the meeting, a few of them could not help but frown. Even if they looked down on this nouveau riche, stinky little brother, they could not ignore him. After all, the Ivy League was one of the big 6, the American lineage. Just like Jixia Land and Dongxia, the Ivy League was a new blood cultivation organization and technical department in the American lineage. It had a pivotal position and was not a small fry that could be easily dismissed. 2 weeks ago, a drone found traces of their frontline base. The chief engineer said they are very cautious about their whereabouts. Their base is hidden at the other end of the outer ring, just outside of our reconnaissance range. In the middle, in order to ensure the sovereignty of the development, we had some friction. Finally, a week ago, the other party made a request for negotiation. And then, Andrea asked, then we launched a saturation attack on their position as a response. The chief engineer said expressionlessly, now it seems that our attitude was not firm enough, causing them to still be hopeful. Beside them, Weisher could not help but want to roll his eyes. If this was not firm enough, then what was firm enough? Could you make a big bomb in hell? Wait, there was no Discovery Protection Convention here, nor was there any astronomical inspection. It could be said that no one knew what happened in the barren mountains and rivers. Maybe these guys were really crazy enough to make a nuclear bomb. With the technical reserves of the ivory tower and the instruments on the Iron Crystal base, could it really be done? Just as Weisher was letting his imagination run wild, they had temporarily finished sorting out the current situation and started a new topic. According to the results brought back by the investigation team, our inference can be confirmed. The old scholar representative said, the village of Dusk here should be the supergiant industrial base created by the Purgatory factory owners in the last War of the Worlds, the Eternal Frozen Furnace. The entire infernal realm is actually made up of countless factories and assembly lines. No, it should be said that everything here is actually a part of a huge machine, and outsiders like us are the gravel and dust that obstruct the smooth operation of the machine. We are going to war with the Purgatory factory owners. Someone asked, this violates the armistice agreement between the present realm and hell. We can't bear this responsibility. No, this infernal realm is currently ownerless. The scholar representative said, in fact, haven't we seen it these days? This place is simply in a state of semi-collapse. Since the last Purgatory factory owners were crippled, they took the initiative to retreat to the withered area and shrink all business and status. Even if they know the situation of the village of Dusk, they can't take it back. Moreover, as long as the ownership of the sequence key has not been registered, then this place doesn't belong to anyone. Our competitor should only be the Ivy League. The word only was used well. It showed what kind of status the stinky younger brother had in the big brother's heart. The perennial academic monopoly allowed the ivory tower to condescendingly view all peers as inferior. Importance was importance, but Contempt was also contempt. By now, the result of the meeting was clear. In order to compete for the Village of Dusk or the Eternal Frozen Furnace, should they fight with the Ivy League? The 8 people present looked at each other. After a long silence, they all looked at Huaishur. It was as if they were asking for his opinion. In the midst of the shock, Huaishur felt 100,000 question marks appear above his head. Why are they looking at me? Why do they have to ask for my opinion on such matters? Just as he was about to wave his hand in a panic and was about to say something, he heard a deep voice behind him. Why don't we just forget about it? A hoarse voice with a metallic echo rang out. It yawned without any energy and sighed tiredly. I keep feeling that it's too troublesome. Let's just pack up and go home. Huaishur turned his head stiffly and saw the steel statue on the pedestal behind him. The iron thinker, who was in deep thought with his eyes lowered, was actually speaking, and he was looking down at him. "Young man, move a little. You're stepping on my foot." Huaishur lowered his head and realized that he had been stepping on the steel statue's instep for an unknown period of time. He even left 2 shoe prints. But in his perception, this should clearly be a pure steel statue. Whether it was from the perception of the hand of restraint or from his attainments in alchemy, it should not belong to the category of being able to move and speak. Also, since everyone was looking at him, didn't that mean this statue that he had been stepping on for half a day was the great Grandmaster? Huaishur almost couldn't take a breath of cold air. He was dumbfounded. Andrea nudged him from the side and reminded him in a low voice, "Be polite. Don't look like you've seen a ghost." But Huaishur swallowed his saliva, unable to understand. "Sorry, did I scare you?" The 3 to 4 meter tall statue said in a low, muffled voice, "Most people are scared when they see me. I know, I'm a little strange. So, there's no need to feel sorry. Don't worry about me. There's only an old man here who can't be used for much. This great Grandmaster, one of the few in the entire territory, the person with the highest authority in the Iron Crystal constellation, Mikhail Ivanovich Zaitsev, sat on the pedestal, but his expression looked a little numb. Looking at the countless projections of data in front of him, he sighed tiredly. In the end, what's the point of all this? Life, the universe, the present realm, hell, and even everything. What are all these things compared to the vast and mighty abyss? Will there be any changes after obtaining the eternal core? It's meaningless. The end result is only emptiness. It doesn't matter. Accompanied by his hoarse words, an indescribable low pressure suddenly enveloped the bridge. An inexorable depression and exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone's heart. The few people in charge seemed to have long been used to this kind of scene and couldn't help but shake their heads. Again, Chapter 530. Grandmaster, have you taken your medicine today? The chief engineer coughed and asked, "What's the difference between taking medicine and not taking medicine? Will the world become better after taking medicine? It's just fake hormone secretion. It can only deceive myself." The Grandmaster drooped his head and said dejectedly, "Compared to the universe, compared to the world, we are just dust. Compared to hell, our existence is just a moment. Whether a moment is happy or sad, it's meaningless. I've been thinking about illusory love, about the ever-changing miracles, but there's no answer to all of this. It's just like my life. I've just accepted an empty reality." Hiss! Huaishur felt the negative energy rushing towards him and sucked in a breath of cold air. The Grandmaster was so terrifying. Even a negative energy nuclear power plant like Huaishur could not stand such a gloomy atmosphere. What was going on? "It's the accident of the last experiment." Andrea leaned closer and whispered, In addition to the qualitative change in his steel body, occasionally after presiding over the ceremony, he will suddenly become depressed. He'll be fine after a while. No, 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 this was not to the extent that he would be fine just by leaving him alone. Why do you still want him to stay in hell? Hurry up and take him to see a psychiatrist. Besides, is it really okay to manage the Iron Crystal constellation in this state? Will he suddenly drive the submarine to hell and self-destruct when he gives up on himself one day? Just as the Grand Master continued to emit negative energy, the few people in charge had already skillfully held down the Grand Master, who was more than 3 meters tall, and poured medicine into his mouth. The Grand Master did not resist. He sat there indifferently, as if he was too lazy to even struggle. Soon, the special alchemy medicine took effect. On the Grand Master's body, the color of steel gradually faded, and the texture of flesh and blood emerged. However, his hair, eyebrows, and eyes still carried the cold light of steel. The qualitative change caused by the alchemy accident still remained in his body. But now, Huaisher could feel that there was a majestic miracle and an equal amount of calamity operating in that enormous body. It was as if he was standing in front of a giant furnace, experiencing the majestic rhythm of countless calamities and miracles woven together. In this half-inhuman body, alchemy reactions were happening all the time. Who knew how many complicated matrices were intertwined to form the great Grand Master in front of him? As he recovered, the real Grand Master Mikhail raised his eyes. His expression was calm and cold. Even his tone was filled with a strong and abnormal mechanical feeling. Since the situation is clear, let's carry it out. He asked, "Does anyone have any objections?" No one said anything. Compared to his previous appearance, his current state was even more inhuman. The gloominess was swept away, and at the same time, it became even more dignified and cold, revealing an enormous sense of existence that was like a raging flame. Huaisher found it hard to understand which part of him was normal. That's it then. I still have things to do, so don't bother me if there's nothing important. During the exploration period, he will be in charge of the Iron Crystal constellation. As he spoke, the great Grand Master casually pointed. In the dead silence, he pointed at the stunned Huaisher. What the hell? Huaisher was dumbstruck and in disbelief. He looked back blankly, after confirming that there was no one behind him and that there was no one in front of him. He looked at the great Grand Master with 100,000 question marks. What do you mean? The great Grand Master frowned and looked over unhappily. I just hate doing these things. So I specially found someone to be in charge. Could it be that Russell, that old bastard, didn't tell you anything? So you've been waiting for me here. Huaisher's expression twitched. He could not help but ask, "You already know that he's an old bastard, so why are you still asking me?" You're right. Obviously, he had a deep understanding of Russell's character. Mikhail nodded slightly and asked, "You're his new secretary?" Yes. Huaisher nodded. Suddenly, a trace of pity appeared from Mikhail's mechanical indifference. He asked again, "A new student?" "More or less." Huaisher shrugged. "Then it's not easy for you." It was as if he was looking at an unlucky person tied to hell's express train. The great Grand Master actually patted him on the shoulder with rare warmth as an encouragement. "Then you see, the decision just now, isn't it what?" Mikhail asked indifferently. "Sympathy is sympathy, work is work. I'm too lazy to care about these things. Since you're the principal's secretary, then you're Russell's representative here. What's wrong with handing these things over to you? No matter how you look at it, it doesn't seem right." Huaisher widened his eyes. He did not know what was going on in Mikhail's mind. He had just arrived at the Iron Crystal constellation and had not even sat down or drank a mouthful of hot water. How did he suddenly become the temporary person in charge of this branch? Even if he was messing around, there should be a limit. Does anyone have any objections? The great Grandmaster raised his head and asked. Suddenly, Huaishi's heart was filled with hope. Yes, everyone here is a senior. How could they see an ignorant newbie riding on their shoulders? They would definitely strongly, wait, why are you all just watching and not saying anything? Huaishi's expression twitched even more violently. She stared at the calm faces around her, hoping to see the slightest bit of indignation in them. However, no one said anything. Instead, a few people nodded in agreement. Since you're the principal's secretary, then that's great. That's good too. Great Grandmaster. You're not very good at dealing with these things. If someone can take over the job, then you can have a good rest. Why is the plot not right here? Huaishi held on to the last glimmer of hope. He looked at Andrea and hoped that she would say something. Andrea seemed to understand his uneasiness and fear. At the crucial moment, the big sister still stood up and chose to speak up for Huaishi. Although teacher Huaishi is young, he has a rich resume, integrity, rich experience, and is good at learning. I believe that as long as he's given some time, he'll definitely be able to adapt to this job. Huaishi was in complete despair. Big sister, did I ask you to help me say this? Martin, where's Martin? Hurry up and say something. When he was anxious to find someone to oppose him, he remembered that the only person who would oppose him, Martin, seemed to have been stuffed into the backup team. Since no one objects, then it's settled. The great Grandmaster waved his hand and said to Huaishi, if there's any technical problem that you can't solve, just ask me. You can solve the rest on your own. Don't bother me. No, wait a minute. Huaishi stopped the great Grandmaster, who was about to leave. Can you at least tell me what exactly I'm supposed to do? Face the problem, deal with the current situation, propose a solution, finalize a plan, and prepare to execute it. If it succeeds or fails miserably, then everyone can go home. Mikhail waved his hand indifferently. Anyway, even if there's a responsibility in the end, I don't need to take responsibility. Nonsense! Of course you don't need to take responsibility. Then what about me? Huaishi was furious. If no one cared, then wouldn't he have to take the blame? If the whole team was wiped out here, even if he went back alive, he would be socially dead in the future. Then I can't help. The great Grandmaster shrugged and waved his hand and left. Only Huaishi and the other people in charge were left looking at each other. On the first day of the business trip, he was arranged to be the head of the place and became the overall person in charge. He was even given a wolf dog. What should he do? It was quite urgent. There was no ostracization, indifference, or alienation as expected. After a few people in charge had a simple introduction with Huaishi, they quickly prepared to hand over the authority in their hands and submit the documents and affairs accumulated over the past few days. Huaishi rejected all of them with the excuse of, tired from the journey, we'll talk about it tomorrow, until he walked out of the bridge. Huaishi still looked numb, and his feet were a little light. He couldn't believe what had happened. Ogiest, who had witnessed the whole process from beginning to end, patted his shoulder sympathetically. No one can go against the great Grandmaster's words and actions, he said. Although this matter is a little against the rules, since the great Grandmaster has personally appointed it, then I can only leave it to you. Wait, Huaishi stopped in his tracks. His absent-minded expression suddenly turned serious, but his eyes became a little strange. He stared straight, making Ogiest a little scared. What's wrong? He asked. You just said that we can't follow the rules, right? Huaishi asked seriously. That is to say, his temporary appointment, my authority, and all the orders and appointments I issue next are all improper and illegal. According to the procedure, that's the case. Ogiest nodded and asked doubtfully, "Are you going to plead your case to the Academy's Teaching and Research Office? I think it's probably not going to work out. You'd better give up." "No." Weischer's smile gradually became cheerful. "I'm just suddenly full of confidence. For some reason, after learning that he was being forced to do something illegal, Weischer's fears suddenly disappeared, and his whole person became 100 times more confident. He felt that there were countless inspirations and plans emerging in his mind, and his energy began to flourish. Every cell in his body was holding back a burst of strength to start something. He was eager to try. It was as if he had suddenly become a different person. It scared Ogiest. He didn't know what was going on with this little brother in front of him, and he didn't know what kind of switch his unintentional words had just pressed. "You must be tired, right?" He guessed. "I'll send you to the dormitory area to rest." "No, time is tight." Weischer smiled, and his eyes lit up with a strange brilliance. "Since the great Grand Master has given me such a heavy responsibility, how can I rest? Let's start by understanding the situation first." He liked this job after all. Chapter 5:31. 2 days later, at the bottom of the Iron Crystal constellation, at the outer testing area where it connected to the ruins, at the intersection of the Iron Crystal constellation and Hell, separated by layers of thick walls, all the observers had already put on thick protective suits. After going through layers of disinfection and inspection, they followed the instructions of the teacher and stood in their own positions. They saw the iron wall in front of them slowly rise. Through the thick, transparent alloy, they could see the blazing and dazzling sunlight from the outside world. Noon. The temperature was a pleasant 27 degrees Celsius. It was a little hot, but tolerable. The blazing sun shone down from the sky, falling on the wasteland and ruins, illuminating the entire hell in silence. It was as if everyone had fallen asleep in this lazy time. There was no sound at all. If this was not the testing area, many students who were a little stiff after staying on the ship for 2 days would want to go out and bask in the sun. Soon, the experimenter in the protective suit walked into the observation area of the students. He stood in the shadows where the sunlight could not reach. He held a foldable umbrella in his hand. After opening it, the umbrella was shockingly large, enough to cover his entire body. Then, he threw the experimental mouse in his hand into the sunlight outside the shadows. The mouse screeched and struggled in fear, but it could not resist the experimenter's actions. When it fell into the sunlight, it spasmed violently. An astonishing change happened in an instant. Under the sun, the little white mouse quickly shriveled. Bursts of green flames rose from its white fur, and it turned into ashes. Then, the shriveled flesh quickly dehydrated and carbonized. In the end, the experimenter picked up a stick and poked it, and it collapsed into a cloud of dust in the wind. But when it was thrown into the sunlight, it was as if it was thrown into molten steel. Not a single bone was left. And in the infrared observation on the right side of the display, after it was slowed down by dozens of times, it could be seen with the naked eye that the tragic nightmare it encountered at that moment, the moment it fell into the sunlight, its body temperature began to rise rapidly. It was as if gasoline had been ignited, instantly increasing by tens of thousands of times. Then, the water in its body evaporated. Its limbs were bathed in flames. Under the gentle embrace of the sunlight, it welcomed the end of its destruction in such an abrupt and tragic manner. The other side of the Twilight Village was revealed in front of all the students. This is a phenomenon of spontaneous combustion. The voice of the experimenter outside the window came from the loudspeaker. Through the thick protective suit, he said indifferently, "Please don't take any chances." In this hell, any creature exposed to the sun will be burned to ashes by their own rising body temperature, unless some special high-level stigmata or special bloodline could increase one's tolerance. Otherwise, there was no way one could survive. This is a warning that 2 members of the first exploration team have risked their lives to bring to everyone. I hope that everyone can treat it seriously. According to the calculations of the central mainframe of the Pharaoh Crystal constellation, even a Tier 5 ascendant wouldn't be able to last long under such sunlight if they weren't prepared. Although it's possible to find a way to escape at that point, based on my observations, none of you seem to have the ability to do so. Therefore, please memorize the ship's safety rules and first aid instructions. Unless it is dusk, please do not attempt to move around the iron crystal. The life-saving umbrellas that have been distributed to everyone can only be used to relieve a temporary emergency. If you are careless because of this and end up incurring a disaster, you can only blame yourself for it. As he spoke, the scholar holding the black umbrella stepped forward and walked into the sunlight. Under the cover of the umbrella, the scholar in the shadows was unharmed. However, the black alchemy coating on the umbrella's outermost layer emitted the sound of burning fuses. The coating on top of it was rapidly cracking and fading. The color changed slightly, from black to scarlet, from scarlet to light red, all the way to pure white, a total of 15 minutes and 41 seconds. When the umbrella turned pure white, it no longer had any effect of blocking the sunlight. However, to be able to last 15 minutes under this kind of curse ray was already commendable. Then, let's move on to the second half of the on-site teaching. Layers of gates fell down, creating an enclosed space in the outer laboratory. Then, a huge iron cage was transported over from the conveyor belt. In the cage, a strange creature covered in strange deformities was struggling and roaring angrily. Soon, after a shot of tranquilizer, it closed its eyes. The scholar closed the umbrella, turned around, and walked into the isolation room. Soon, a small square box appeared on the conveyor belt. The countdown on it quickly passed, and the moment it reached 0, the box quietly opened a gap. The darkness that was sealed inside turned into mist and overflowed. The viscous darkness filled every inch of the air in the laboratory. It was like a living creature that was baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. It even eroded the transparent alloy outermost layer. The students retreated a little in the chaos. Then, someone saw that the body temperature of the giant beast in the infrared observation was rapidly dimming and disappearing. It was like a candle that was extinguished in the darkness, leaving no trace. When the isolation door opened again, the sunlight shone down, and the darkness instantly evaporated. Only the remains of the giant beast in the cage were left, still in a state of deep sleep. It seemed to have awakened at the last moment. Its ferocious face was full of panic and despair, but it was powerless to resist. It turned into a stone statue in the absolute darkness. After the scholar hammered down, the cracked surface of the iron stone was exposed. From the inside to the outside, not a single inch was spared. As you can see now, under the sun, all living creatures will quickly spontaneously combust. Once night falls, in the darkness without light, the body temperature will quickly drop until there is no more heat. The petrification from the inside out is irreversible. The scholar paused for a moment, threw down the hammer in his hand, and said coldly, "Once the petrification is complete, it is truly dead. There will not be any origin substance left. Please remember this. In addition to the surface of the umbrella, the handle of the umbrella is equipped with a dawn candle that can burn for 30 minutes. I will not demonstrate it here. This is the end of the introduction to the Twilight Village. If you have any questions, you can ask the teacher in charge after the training. Now, please step forward according to the group number I read, and go to each position for practice. There is no need to be nervous. The work given to you is not important. It is just to give you a bit of experience and to prevent you from being too relaxed. Next, group number 001 will step forward. On the stairs on the second floor of the test area, Weischer withdrew his gaze after seeing this. He led his two students in the direction of the bridge. Along the way, many staff members recognized the new person in charge and greeted him rather politely. Weischer smiled and responded to them one by one. Sometimes he would stop and chat with them, but the thoughts in his mind had long drifted to God knows where. It could only be said that the job of the person in charge was not something you would know if you didn't do it. Today, he learned that the position of vice principal was not easy. Including the Iron Crystal, there was a branch base, 16 unmanned outposts and scattered detectors, and drones everywhere. Every day, there were unexpected events and accumulated problems from the past. Everyone's food and water, the daily consumption of the core furnace, the maintenance and regulation of the internal framework, the list of requirements of the 6 laboratories, the research materials that needed to be replenished, the replacement of consumable equipment, the hundreds of local sample requests submitted every day, the news and support of the outside exploration team. The lives of the entire ship, including the students, staff, and exploration team, totaled 941 people. Now, all of them were in Weischer's hands, even if it was only in name. Things like organizations had inertia in and of themselves. Since a long time ago, the Iron Crystal Base had been managed and operated in an extremely efficient and flat manner. Apart from some necessary procedures, there was nothing that could be delayed or wasted time inside the base. Every one of them had multiple roles, and they were doing well under the immense pressure of hell. The 8 people in charge could perfectly solve more than 90% of the problems and incidents in their areas of responsibility. Weischer did not need to intervene at all. He did not even have any room to intervene. Have some self-awareness. Okay? Professional things should be done by professionals. Don't think too highly of yourself. In the face of Weischer's appointment as the person in charge, no one jumped out to make trouble because there was no need to. Even when the Grand Master did not care, the Iron Crystal had formed a complete and self-managed virtuous cycle inside. Otherwise, with the Grand Master's illness acting up every 2 to 3 days, it would have collapsed a long time ago. It could only be said that the idealistic elements of the Ascendants were resisting all bureaucratic changes. Although it would become very complicated in the real world, it was quite straightforward and simple in hell. Now that Weischer had arrived, all the department heads were very cooperative and reported their positions and all the work content, transferring their own authority and certification. Furthermore, the announcement was broadcasted to inform everyone of the news. All the secrets and content were transparent to Weischer. As long as Weischer was willing to see, all the confidential information was not hidden from him at all. This included the 16 research results in the laboratory and the progress of the 4 long-term projects, as well as the more than 20 alchemy formulas recently discovered. As the dean's representative, not to mention the Iron Crystal, even in the Research Institute, he could see and take as he wanted. No one was blind enough to jump out and make things difficult for Weischer, and no one wanted to give Weischer a show of strength. No one jumped out and said a few words of sarcasm to make Weischer retreat. Weischer could not be happy. He had originally planned to capture the 2 who were jumping the most and kill them as a sacrifice. Then he would use various methods to seize his own power, suppress the scale of the conflict, divide the conflict, and find out who was his ally and who was his enemy. Finally, he would succeed in taking over the position. What a good and refreshing theme. Why was there no more? Do you feel like you've missed out on hundreds of thousands of words? In his own office, Weischer suddenly asked out of nowhere. Assistant 19 looked up blankly. He did not know what his teacher was talking about. Chapter 532. In fact, Weischer's job was very simple. He didn't need to draw up a plan, or even be in charge of every project. He just needed to make a decision, to decide the fate of the Iron Crystal constellation. The 8 people in charge followed their missions and duties, and after perfectly performing their duties, they would submit all the reports to Weischer, waiting for his reply. Yes or no? The maintenance of the outer armor, the replacement of equipment, the replacement of personnel, the rescue of the expedition team, and even the daily food supply. Weischer didn't have to know the details of how to execute, and he didn't have to know what to do best. He just had to decide whether to do it or not, as long as he knew what the consequences would be if he messed it up. In fact, everything would be written in the report without hiding anything, and they were even afraid of not looking good. There would be many cases of lessons for Weischer to refer to. The 2 operation teams that left the Iron Crystal constellation to explore Hell had lost contact. One of them sent an irregular rescue signal, while the other team sent an intermittent alarm. Respond. Rescue? Should we be on guard against them? Due to an accident during the recovery of supplies, there are signs of mild erosion and bacterial infection in Area D1. Temporarily stop work to clean up and disinfect. The food supply can still last for 3.5 months, but transfer the now extremely short manpower to local plant cultivation and edible meat research. Continue the exploration, retreat, psychological counseling for the operation personnel who are under too much mental stress for more than a week. All kinds of things, big and small, were piled up in front of Weischer, waiting for his reply. Yes or no, what to do if it was yes, and who to send to do it. Every decision would affect the next operation of the Iron Crystal constellation. Would the actions now bring benefits while at the same time incur negative consequences in the future? Should be prepared and on guard. On the entire Iron Crystal constellation, 940 pairs of eyes were staring at Weischer, waiting for his next move. There was no need to doubt the result. It was pleasantly surprised and satisfying. Even Andrea and the 8 people in charge of the original departments didn't expect Weischer to be able to do this. To be honest, they were already prepared to face 8 gods and a dog. Moreover, he had secretly prepared a lot of plans to pay for Weischer's mistakes, and also to provide him with trial and error costs. If it really didn't work out, he would quickly invite a great grandmaster to fix the mess, but in reality, those plans didn't come in handy. Although she had neglected some details, when it came to the big picture, Weischer was as steady as an old dog that had turned into a spirit. He didn't look like a young man who dared to fight and charge. He was extremely cowardly. The intuition brought about by the premonition of death and the new skill, false wisdom, brought about by the 10,000 cycles of the Vientiane heavenly sphere were combined. Even if he couldn't make the right decision, it was enough for him to avoid most of the wrong choices. In the face of such huge pressure and complicated affairs, Weischer showed incredible calmness in the subsequent work except for his initial hesitation. It was as if he was already used to it. Although he would occasionally sigh and fret in private, he would never show any weakness or hesitation in public. I even improved the terrible document writing format of the Iron Crystal constellation, whether it was his disguise and acting skills or his calmness and confidence from the bottom of his heart in the development and exploration of Hell. With such a leader, the staff below could at least feel more at ease. It was better than a wailing and indecisive piece of trash sitting at the top every day. In any case, In the hearts of the 8 department heads, they had all given the performance of the principal's secretary a passing mark. It didn't matter if such a person was a cold-blooded schemer who didn't care about the deaths of others, or a heroic figure who was ambitious, courageous, and far-sighted enough to guide them out of their predicament. Even if it was just for show, wouldn't you nod when your subordinates were all ready? As for whether Weischer putting his name at the bottom of the emergency evacuation list was for show or not, they didn't care at all. Now that both sides worked together without any gaps, the iron crystal seat was operating again, and everything was developing in a good direction. Everyone seemed to be doing well, except for Lynn Sergio, who couldn't sleep every day until 4 or 5 in the morning. He was scared out of his wits because of his teacher. Others might not know, but how could he not know? As a genius on the path of evil karma, he could instinctively feel how much evil thoughts had accumulated in his teacher's body in these short 2 days when he was working. He could almost feel that there was a shocking conspiracy brewing in his teacher's heart almost every moment, and it was about to set off a bloody storm. However, he didn't dare to say anything or ask anything. He could only pretend that he didn't know anything every day. In fact, his legs behind the desk were trembling in fear. Afraid. In fact, Weischer's brain was just out of habit. Since he took office yesterday until now, in the 48 hours, Weischer didn't know why, but the impulse and idea of seizing power always appeared in his mind, as well as the ideas and plans that came out of nowhere. He always felt that it was very feasible. As long as there was enough time, he even felt that he had a 40% chance of completely seizing power, getting rid of the current authority on the surface, wiping out the influence left behind by the great master, and truly becoming the person in charge of the iron crystal seat. But what the hell was he thinking? He didn't want to be the scapegoat at all. In fact, if the situation allowed, he would simply stay as far away from this position as possible. But now, it felt like there was a small red button in front of a naughty child. From time to time, Weischer wanted to press it. There was an impulse in his heart that told him, no matter what happens, press it. But Weischer wasn't completely out of his mind. How could he use everyone's trust to do something like this? Even if he had an impulse occasionally, it was just a thought in his mind. He didn't know if it was false wisdom that helped him avoid this wrong choice. Weischer scratched his head, leaned against the chair, and drank 2 mouthfuls of coffee. Just as he was about to go out for a breather, Yuan, who was also temporarily acting as Weischer's assistant and secretary, pushed the door open and entered with a serious expression. Teacher, the investigation team reported that the rescue team sent out yesterday afternoon has just found the person who asked for help and sent back their findings. Ms. Andrea said that this will have a huge impact on the upcoming exploration of the iron crystal seat. She invited you to attend the meeting. Weischer was stunned and immediately got up. I'll go now. After leaving most of the work to her and little 19, Weischer hurriedly pushed the door open and left. After hearing the sound of the door closing, Forrest Hutt finally couldn't hold it in anymore. He slumped on the chair, sweating profusely. Why don't we swap places? He put his hands together and sincerely asked Yuan, I'll go outside to run errands. Can you come to the office and work? I can't take it anymore. Yuan tilted her head and looked at him blankly. Then she was sure that this guy was crazy again, according to what her teacher said. Just give him a beating. 5 minutes later, inside the bridge, even the great master, who didn't want to get involved, was pulled over. Everyone came to the front line under the influence of the exploration team. They looked at the data on the screen. The image seemed to be the interior of a giant factory. Between countless huge pipelines, there was a huge metal cube structure. It was the size of a small building and had long been covered with dust. It seemed to have been abandoned. It was impossible to see what kind of equipment it was. and the frontline investigation team was communicating with this place through the costly border relics. They followed the guidance of the experts and used the analysis tools they carried with them to conduct various tests on the equipment in front of them. Then, Huaisher noticed that as the parameters were transmitted, the expressions of the scholars became more and more unsightly, while the alchemist's expressions became more and more fanatical. It was completely different. After the last step of the test, the person in charge of the operation team issued the order to stay put and wait for support. The communication was quickly cut off. If the test results are not wrong, it proves that the great master's guess is right. Andrea took the lead and said, "In addition to the core of the tower, there are other sub-control structures in this hell, and there should be more than one." Another alchemist added, "Considering the size of the Twilight Village, there should be at least 10 if you want to control it comprehensively." Is there a result? Huaisher coughed, reminding himself of his existence. He once again restrained the impulse to seize power in his mind and waited patiently. "Yes, that's right," the scholar's representative said, solemnly. "After preliminary inspection, we suspect that what the frontline exploration team found is the mechanism that adjusts the internal parameters of hell. If the Twilight Village is a machine, then this should be one of the controllers." Controller? Huaisher understood this point. Controlling those factories? Or can it interfere with the most heavily guarded tower in the center? No, the tower should be the main control center of the Eternal Frost Core. These sub-control structures may not have the authority to interfere with the upper level, but I'm afraid they don't control those factories. But this hell... Huaisher frowned. "That's too general. How do you explain it?" After a moment of silence, the old man finally said, "Most of these are some guesses I made based on the great master's research. In the absence of evidence, it can't be used as a basis for reference. However, I still think that the curse of day and night here is related to these sub-control devices. If we control them, maybe we can find a solution to a certain extent." Then what are we waiting for? Huaisher made a decision on the spot. "Get ready to move. Don't worry about anything else. Let's take down this sub-control device first. Do you need my signature and certification?" It was better to take action than to do nothing. After the exploration progress had been stagnant for a long time, they finally welcomed a good news. Then, the communications director brought a bad news. The communications department has just completed a preliminary analysis of the alarm from another exploration team. The communications director waved his hand and showed the photo on the projection. "Our exploration drones have found traces of a large-scale summoning by the Ivy League," he said. "They are calling for foreign aid." Chapter 533. This is a good opportunity to seize power. Hearing the words of the head of communications, Huaisher's eyes suddenly lit up. Then, various scenes that were about to appear continuously appeared in his mind. First, he would stimulate the conflict between the two sides, then start a war. Maybe he would need to use some small methods to establish his prestige, further squeeze out the other leaders, gradually marginalize the existence of the Grand Master, establish his own power, and finally completely integrate the Iron Crystal Constellation into, wait, why is my thinking slipping again? His expression changed slightly, but it was interpreted by the people next to him as confusion and shock, but they did not feel that there was any problem. After all, he is a young man. Hearing that the enemy has reinforcements, it is understandable that he would feel panic and unease. But they did not expect that other than thinking of seizing power, there was only one thing in this guy's mind. My hands are itching. This is a picture of the scene. The head of communications coughed and pointed at the picture on the screen. A large site built between the ruins, like an altar, vaguely distinguishable traces of alchemy, and there were several giant signal devices that had been scrapped. Due to the influence of the depth and manpower, the Ivy League will probably not send large-scale reinforcements in a short period of time. Therefore, if I were the leader of the other side, out of convenience and efficiency, it is very likely that I would carry out army recruitment on the spot and recruit a large group of people in hell to fight for me. Our exploration team has found many traces left behind by the altar that point to the depth and withering zones. It is very likely that they will rely on the influence of the Ivy League in the abyss to get the help of many armies. Of course, the Tomb of the Returnless may also be involved. After the head of communications finished his report, he was silent for a moment and looked at the purser. The purser shook his head after a short moment of thought. Although our research and exploration progress is far ahead of theirs, the Ivory Tower will not invest more manpower here in a short period of time. After about 2 weeks, the students will gradually be able to take over some of the things on the ship, and then some people will be able to be freed. But if we compare the two sides, we are in a disadvantageous position. Then we should also call for people, Huaisher suddenly said. Even without the dragon summoning flute, the Ivory Tower can't not have a few contracts in hell, right? Although there are many army contracts in hand, they may not be able to respond due to the distance. Secondly, the trustworthiness of mercenaries is not high. Even if they have signed a contract, there are times when they betray their employer and betray them. If they are not under strong pressure, I'm afraid they will slack off in battle. The purser said the other branches may have more experience, but the Pharaoh Crystal Constellation is more inclined towards large-scale mobile laboratories. We don't have experience in this area. There was no doubt that the Ivory Tower had the upper hand in this abyss exploration. Just look at the existence of the Iron Crystal Constellation. With such a mobile base, even if they ran into the withered zones, as long as they didn't provoke any rulers, they could still escape unscathed. It was precisely because of this that most of the division's energy was actually placed on the Iron Crystal Throne. It was more than enough for defense, but not enough for offense. In contrast, the other branch of the Research Institute, White Dove, was on the other end of the spectrum. There were not many researchers, or rather, everyone was a researcher and, at the same time, an explorer on the front line. There were only 6 of them in total. They never needed a laboratory, nor did they need the cooperation of others. They would drill in hell for decades without knowing if they were dead or alive. They would drill in wherever there was danger, and wherever there was the most trouble, these troublemakers would always be there. Every one of these people had a bunch of army contracts and countless border relics in their hands. Rather than saying that they were doing research, it was better to say that they were leading a bunch of mercenaries to rob in hell. If they encountered any results or discoveries, they would just send a signal, and the other branches would quickly dive down to take over the research results. It was not that they had not worked together before, and everyone had a deep impression of the violent researchers' exaggerated style. If they cooperated here, with one attacking and one defending, the efficiency would definitely be much higher. But it was hard to buy with money. Now that the Ivy League knew that they could not beat the Ivory Tower in competition, it was natural for them to ask for external help. In the worst case, they could just share some of the research results. If they could get some, it would be better than not getting anything after the Ivory Tower got their hands on it. And these days, the purpose of the Iron Crystal Constellation was to completely control this hell in their hands and completely transform it into the Ivory Tower's production base and factory. How could they share the shares of their own base? This kind of plan to share the spoils of war was out of the question. The value of the Twilight Village lay in its huge production capacity after it returned to normal. If they wanted to preserve its value, they would definitely need to do delicate work. There was no way to endlessly squander the power to fight. Otherwise, it would be putting the cart before the horse. Even if they won in the end, it would be useless to bring back an empty shell. Therefore, whether or not they could suppress the other side during the exploration and expand their own advantage became the key point now. After a short moment of thinking, Huaishur quickly sorted out the current priorities in his mind. Therefore, he raised his head and suggested, "If you have no experience, why don't you leave it to me? I'll preside over the army recruitment." Huaishur said, "You can also leave the management of the Hell Group to me. Anyway, you can discuss the Iron Crystal constellation, so there won't be any accidents. So instead of letting me be a decoration here, it's better to find a place where it's easier to display my value." In a short silence, the few people in charge looked at each other. "You'll do it. That's a good idea." But the problem was, could the young man in front of them control those brutal monsters? That was not something that could be done by reason and the spirit of the contract. In hell, even if a contract was signed, there would be endless variables. Can you handle it? Seeing that no one stood out to reject it, Huaishur knew there was a way. He said, "First of all, I have the resume and experience of an inspector of the Astronomy Association. I'm clear about the laws and rules of hell." He was completely bullshitting. He had been an inspector for a year and had not even finished reading the rules of the Astronomy Association. The only thing he knew about the laws of hell was when he chatted with the teacher in the next class. But the others did not know that this teacher, Huai in front of them, was just for show. They all nodded in agreement. Secondly, I'm the young arbiter of celestial genealogy. For the Hell Group, I won't be as difficult to integrate as the Ascendants. If you can ignore prejudice, I'm actually more suitable than the others to communicate with them. What he said made sense. Then, I'm a disaster musician, the Abyss Cook Demon, and also the Prince of Hell Paradise. I also have authority among the Abyss group. Huaishur said these words powerfully. If he ignored the background of the Book of Destiny and the Astronomy Association, he would begin to wonder why he had not turned into a traitor and sought refuge in the abyss in search of a bright future. Finally, I'm the principal's secretary and can also be seen as his agent. I have such authority and the right to negotiate with them. He did not hesitate to use the tiger skin that Russell had thrown to him as a banner. Anyway, the title was given for free. It would be a waste not to use it. Huaishur was also a little angry that he had been inexplicably stuffed into the position of the Celestial Crystal's chief supervisor and the chief scapegoat. Although he would not delay his work because of personal matters, wouldn't he be letting down Russell and the others' painstaking efforts if he did not cause some trouble? Moreover, he wanted to personally come into contact with the large groups that had already formed and feel the difference between his own group and the other Hell groups. At the same time, in the following exploration and development, he would let them gain some experience points and see if they could improve. This was the most important thing for Huaishur at the moment. Of course, he did not want to admit that the biggest reason was that he had only been on the ship for 2 days and could not stay any longer. He wanted to go out for a few rounds. It would be even better if he could tear down something to stretch his muscles and bones. Since Huaishur had said so, the others did not object. Even if he was the leader in name, Huaishur was still the highest person in charge. Huaishur's performance in the past 2 days had already gained their recognition. Naturally, no one thought that Huaishur would make a mistake because of a moment of impulse. Then it's decided. Huaishur made the decision, and the meeting ended. Accompanied by a violent roar, large unmanned construction vehicles had already begun to clear the wreckage of the buildings near the Celestial Crystal Station to make room for the next summoning. About 4 or 5 hours later, a flat cement floor had appeared among the ruins. Then, with the cooperation of the alchemists, the large secret instrument for the summoning was also completed. Just as dusk arrived, the temporary station for the Hell groups on the periphery was also built. They even took out a few precious depth maintenance instruments to resist the curse of day and night outside. As the stern of the ship opened, Huaishur had already walked out with several metal boxes and walked straight to the center of the alchemy array. With the experience of using the dragon summoning flute last time, the summoning this time was a walk in the park. The interior of the celestial crystal station itself also stored a large number of tokens from various hells, so there was no need to directly take a loudspeaker to the public to shout. It was equivalent to calling each of them privately through a ritual. If they already had a long-term appointment with each other, they could even be directly called over. However, there was a certain degree of danger in this. Therefore, in order to ensure Huaishur's safety, the Celestial Crystal Station decided to equip him with a wolf dog. The only dog on the entire ship, although it was forcibly named a wolf dog. After all, this thing did not look like a wolf dog at all. Huaishur lowered his head and looked at the pile of mosaics squatting beside his legs. Yes, it was a pile of mosaics, white and gray, randomly piled up and pieced together to form the outline of a dog. And it seemed to be sitting on the ground like a real dog, shaking its mosaic tail and opening its mouth to breathe. There was also a sign on its back with 2 words written on it, "Wolf Dog." Amazing. It seemed to have felt something. From just now until now, it had been trying to pull Huaishur's legs and use its head to push against Huaishur's saddlebag. It anxiously barked. It was not until War and Peace poked its head out of the saddlebag and meowed unhappily that the wolf dog finally quieted down a little. It really wanted to play with the cat. By the way, today's cat was white. Peace. Hopefully, it could really be peaceful. Huaishur opened the box. Chapter 5:34. According to the instructions of the alchemists, Huaishur first opened the top box, took out the token from it, a blood-stained mirror, and put it into the socket of the secret instrument. Then, according to the order, after putting in a lot of materials, a light quickly lit up. It's here, it's here. Huaishur's eyes lit up, and the familiar card drawing process began. But when the light was extinguished, there was nothing in the secret instrument. There was nothing, no sound, and no existence that followed the summons. The Fire Eye settlement did not respond to Huaishur's summons. He was stunned for a moment, turned around, and looked at Lin Shurjo in the distance. Lin Shurjo was also at a loss. Soon, he conveyed the bridge's suggestion to Huaishur, "Continue." After a short moment of silence, Huaishur quickly changed the sacrificial offering in the secret ritual and replaced the token. A palm-sized straw doll was placed into the socket. The light lit up and disappeared immediately. Still, there was nothing there. The Thunder Mountain did not respond. Silence came again. This time, without waiting for the bridge's suggestion, Huaishur began to move. He put in a shrunken and shriveled monkey head and activated the secret instrument. After the light dissipated, the secret instrument was empty. The hidden god mansion did not respond to Huaishur's summons. When Huaishur changed the medium for the 4th time, the array of the secret instrument pointed to Midsummer Night's Dream. With the light, the silence was finally broken. A strange creature, similar to a giant groundhog, was projected from it. It was wearing a miner's hard hat on its head, a strange jacket on its upper body, and a shovel on its shoulder. The precipitating otter, a large group of abyss creatures famous for their excavation and underground fortifications. At the same time, they were one of the partners of the Ivory Tower in Hell. They participated in the construction of many branches. But now, after the projection came down, the precipitating otter looked around and scrutinized Huaishur's unfamiliar face. After confirming that it was the Ivory Tower's summons, it opened its mouth and made a sharp sound. Its voice was extremely loud, as if several subwoofers had exploded at the same time. Huaishur was confused by the roar, not knowing what it was doing. However, the mosaic wolf dog next to him raised the sign on its body. The words on the sign changed and began to translate for Huaishur the sharp sounds of, ah. I'm sorry, friend, the ivory tower. The precipitated otter roared and shouted, your summons, this time, can't answer us. Why? Huaishur asked. Activating, someone thunder's roar. After that, the groundhog-like leader of the group bowed to Huaishur and disappeared in the projection. Thunderous roar. Huaishur stared blankly for a long time in disbelief. If he didn't specifically study history when he was studying alchemy, he wouldn't know what this thing was. To some extent, this series of things didn't have any F*** use at all. It was purely a symbol and decoration used to symbolize identity and represent something. Sometimes it was expensive beyond words. Sometimes it was worthless, just like the Hua Biao of the Eastern Summer genealogy, the holy icon of the Russian Federation genealogy, the nun of the Roman genealogy, and the proclamation of the New World of the American genealogy. Not only the present realm, but even the major forces in the abyss had such a symbol. This kind of thing couldn't be used without permission. Not only was it extremely troublesome to make, it was also a consumable that would disappear after it was used up. But at the same time, it could also represent the wishes of the forces that it belonged to, just like the thunderous roar of the Sea of Titans, which represented the hell of the withered area. This group of abyssal pygmies who inherited the giant's blood was the undisputed overlord of the withered area. In the last War of Worlds, they had destroyed the great trust represented by the purgatory factory owners here. Since the thunderous roar was blown here, it meant that the authority of the Sea of Titans had also descended here. All the hell that didn't belong to the Sea of Titans were not allowed to enter. It was like a rabbit that didn't dare to enter the territory of a tiger. It didn't matter whether the tiger was here or not. Once they entered, it meant provocation. But if the Sea of Titans really wanted to compete with the Ivory Tower for the ownership of this hell, they would have shown themselves a long time ago. Why didn't they blow it earlier or later? They didn't blow it when the Ivy League called for people, but when it was their turn, they started blowing it. It was obvious that it was the Ivy League's doing. But this was the most troublesome part about the ritual tool. It didn't matter whether the big shots it represented were here or not, but whether you cared about those big shots. Indeed, hell was so big, and there were so many factions. The Sea of Titans' reputation might not be useful everywhere, and there were definitely a lot of opposing factions. However, the Ivy League only needed to blow a trumpet to reduce the number of summoning options available to him by more than half. Huaishur's mood suddenly became bad. Not far away, Lin Shurjo felt that the teacher was getting worse and worse, and shrank back a little more. Huaishur didn't fly into a rage. He just stood under the dim yellow sunset and quietly finished smoking a cigarette. After he raised his foot to extinguish the cigarette, he picked and chose among the tokens in the box and filtered out those that would definitely not respond to him. What was left were the opposing factions of the Sea of Titans and the huge group that didn't care about these disputes at all. Similarly, the employment price would definitely be more expensive and harsh. But now, did Huaishur have a choice? He calmly put a piece of the shriveled snake corpse into the summoning secret tool, and then waited quietly. As the light lit up, a huge shadow slowly rose from it. The pressure from the leader of a large group spread with scarlet pupils. The Ivory Tower, the gargoyle, a bat-winged demon that looked like it was made of iron and stone, appeared in the secret tool. It lowered its head and stared at its summoner. It's a strange face. It doesn't matter. He paused and asked indifferently, "Young man, I have come according to the summoning of the Ivory Tower." Do you need the Ironstone settlement to fight for you? A huge pressure spread forward, but the expected panic did not appear. The young man looked up at him and nodded calmly. Yes. Disaster musician? Hey, I have seen humans like you. The gargoyle seemed to become a little strange, but soon returned to normal, but its tone was not so cold. It sounds like you are quite satisfied with me. Huaisha raised his eyebrows slightly. Can we start talking about the conditions? The gargoyle was silent for a long time, and its tone gradually became serious. Our asking price is not cheap. I understand. Huaisha shrugged and listened attentively. Then, how about a castle? After a brief look, the gargoyle opened its bloody mouth. There needs to be enough space for 40 gargoyles to camp and rest in. The specific specifications are here. A piece of parchment emerged from its sharp claws. On it was a detailed description of the specific area of the castle and the internal configuration, including the detailed specifications of the tower, the city wall, and the moat. It even included the materials needed for the secret tool inside. Everything was of the highest specifications. This was the price of hiring them. As a gargoyle that had once been a guardian, it was also known as the Night Dragon. While it had strong combat power, it also had good integrity and moral character that was rarely seen in the abyss. At least, it had never been heard of them betraying their employers. However, the asking price was always high, and they would always refuse the employer's unreasonable requests. In short, although they had integrity and were not weak in combat, they were very difficult to serve. And for betrayers of the contract, they would chase them to the ends of the earth at all costs. If Huaisha did not fulfill his promise after agreeing here, then all the gargoyles in hell would regard the ivory tower as their #1 enemy. What the ivory tower needed to pay was to build a castle for them to live in hell within a year, and in return, there would be 20 gargoyles fighting for him here. The deadline was 3 months. After the last day of the 3rd month, they would not stay for even a second longer. In all fairness, this price was already very exaggerated. It had to be said that the gargoyle's price was a bit high, but Huaisha agreed very quickly. After all, he was not the one paying. There would not be a second time for him to swipe his card and pay for Russell's bill. The moment Huaisha signed his name, dozens of huge and ferocious silhouettes walked out of the summoning secret tool. In addition to the one who had just negotiated with Huaisha, 20 gargoyles from the Dark Abyss stronghold appeared in the secret tool with their spears and javelins. In the next 3 months, they would fight for the ivory tower. In addition to the terrifying defense of these flying hell species, they were made of iron and stone. In other words, even if they were exposed to the night of the Twilight Village, they would not have to worry about being petrified. Their combat ability had been recognized through countless mercenary wars. Then, Huaisha waved his hand, indicating for Lin Sergio to bring the gargoyles into the outer encampment, still in front of the summoning secret tool, and then put in the next medium. As the light lit up, a black naga riding a huge lizard appeared in the engraving. He was covered in black scales, carrying a bow and a scimitar on his back. His yellow vertical pupils stared straight at Huaisha and slightly contracted. He seemed to be scrutinizing. Huaisha tilted his head and also looked at him. After a long time, he smiled and said, "Name a price." In this way, half an hour later, 21 gargoyles, 80 Naga undead army, and an army of more than 800 abyss ratmen, a total of 3 large groups from hell joined the Iron Crystal Constellation's camp. After watching the noisy ratmen crowded together into the distance, Huaisha raised his head and stared at the twilight in the sky that was about to disappear, but he did not stop the summoning. Instead, after a short silence, he pulled out the Sword of Virtue from his arms and inserted it into the array. The light lit up again. You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.